It started with a rainstorm, 3 days of endless downpour that turned the roads to rivers and painted the town in shades of ash and bone. I came to Echo Valley looking for silence. Instead, I found a tunnel that speaks in voices no one should hear, including my own name. They warned me not to go near it, said the mountain remembers, said the dead echo louder in there than the living ever could. But I didn't listen, and now I can't unhear what I heard.
The Echo Tunnel. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when I first arrived in Echo Valley. Not the gentle, life-giving rain that nurtures spring flowers, but the kind of cold, relentless downpour that turns dirt roads to mud and seems to wash away all color from the world. Through the rhythmic sweep of my windshield wipers, the town materialized like a watercolor painting left in the rain, all muted grays and faded greens, nestled in a valley surrounded by towering pines and the perpetual mist of the Oregon mountains. I hadn't planned to stay long. Echo Valley was just supposed to be one more stop on my research journey, one more forgotten railroad town to document for my book on America's abandoned transit systems. 3 days, maybe a week at most, to photograph the old station house, inspect what remained of the tracks, and interview a few elderly residents who might remember the town's brief glory days as a lumber transport hub. That was 6 months ago. My name is Jason Carter. Until 2 years ago, I was a war correspondent, filing stories from combat zones across the Middle East and Central Asia. I'd been good at my job, too good, perhaps. I had an instinct for being in the wrong place at the right time, for finding the stories that needed to be told, no matter how dangerous the telling might be. Then came Fallujah and the IED, and the 3 colleagues who didn't make it back. I survived, physically at least. Mentally, well, that's a different story. The doctors called it PTSD. I called it the end of my career. The panic attacks, the nightmares, the way my hands would shake uncontrollably at the slightest loud noise. I couldn't function in a war zone anymore. I couldn't even function in New York, with its constant cacophony of car horns, construction, and 8 million people living their lives at maximum volume. So I retreated, first to my sister's guest house in Vermont, then to a succession of increasingly smaller towns as I began work on what my former editor mockingly called my train spotting book. A project with no deadlines, no danger, no demands, just endless miles of rusting rails and the ghosts of America's industrial past. The Echo Valley Motel sat just off the main highway, a single-story horseshoe of rooms facing a gravel parking lot with the flickering neon sign promising vacancy and color TV, the latter being a vintage RCA set that received 3 channels when the weather was clear. The elderly owner, a perpetually suspicious man named Harold, had squinted at my New York driver's license like it was counterfeit currency before reluctantly handing over the key to room 7. Just passing through, he'd asked, in a tone that suggested this was the only acceptable reason for a stranger to visit Echo Valley. Research for a book, I'd replied, watching his expression shift from suspicion to a peculiar blend of concern and resignation. About the railroad? That's right. I understand there's an old tunnel nearby that's still largely intact. Harold had gone silent then, his weathered hands pausing on the credit card machine. The silence stretched uncomfortably before he spoke again. Echo tunnels on private property now. County sealed it up years ago anyway. Nothing to see. He slid my receipt across the counter with finality. Valley Diner down the road stays open till 8. Meatloaf's decent. I'd nodded my thanks and retreated to my room, already accustomed to the initial resistance I encountered in small towns suspicious of outsiders. But something about Harold's reaction had been different. Not the usual territorial protectiveness, but something closer to fear. That first night in Echo Valley, I dreamed of tunnels. Not the railway tunnel I'd come to document, but the cramped, lightless passageways of urban warfare. The kind I'd navigated in Fallujah, with my heart in my throat and a camera in my sweating hands. In the dream, I was following the sound of someone calling my name, the voice echoing so confusingly I couldn't determine its direction. I kept turning corners into identical passageways, the voice growing neither louder nor softer, no matter how far I walked. I woke at 3:17 a.m., gasping for breath, sheets soaked with sweat despite the room's chill. Outside my window, The rain continued its steady percussion on the motel's metal awning. I fumbled for the prescription bottle on the nightstand, dry swallowed a pill, and sat in the darkness, waiting for my heart rate to slow. Echo Valley. Even the name seemed to mock me. I'd come seeking silence, yet found myself in a place named for repetition, for sound returning to its source. As I sat listening to the rain, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a terrible mistake coming here, or perhaps that I'd been drawn here for reasons I didn't yet understand. Morning brought no relief from the rain, but did offer the small comfort of routine. I showered, dressed, and walked the short distance to the Valley Diner, a chrome-trimmed relic that looked like it had been airlifted straight from the 1950s and dropped onto the town's main street. Inside, the handful of patrons fell silent as I entered, a brief lull in conversation that I'd grown accustomed to as an outsider in small communities. I took a seat at the counter and ordered coffee from a waitress whose name tag identified her as Doris. She was perhaps 60, with hair dyed an improbable shade of auburn and the efficient movements of someone who'd been doing the same job for decades. "You're staying over at Harold's place," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's right. Just got in yesterday." "Writing a book," he said. She poured my coffee with practiced precision. "About the railroad. News traveled fast in Echo Valley, apparently." "That's right. Specifically about abandoned railways and the towns they've left behind. Echo Valley was once a major transport hub for the lumber industry, wasn't it?" Doris glanced up at me, then past me to the other patrons before responding. "Used to be. Long time ago now. Not much to tell." She slid a laminated menu toward me. "Special today is Denver omelet. Comes with hash browns and toast." It was the same gentle deflection I'd received from Harold, and it only heightened my curiosity. In most towns, locals were eager, sometimes overly eager, to share their history, to ensure their community's brief moment of importance wasn't forgotten. Echo Valley's reluctance was unusual, to say the least. I ordered the special and pulled out my notebook, reviewing my research notes while I waited. Echo Valley had boomed briefly in the 1920s as the Northwest lumber industry expanded, its strategic location making it ideal for transporting timber from the surrounding forests to larger markets. The railroad had been the town's lifeline, with the Echo Tunnel representing a significant engineering achievement, cutting through a mountain to create a direct route that saved days of travel time. According to my notes, construction on the tunnel had begun in 1928 and was completed in 1931, an impressive timeline given the economic constraints of the early Depression. The tunnel had remained in active use until the late 1960s, when the decline of the local lumber industry and the rise of highway transport had rendered it obsolete. The railway company had abandoned the line, and the tunnel had been officially sealed in 1972 for safety reasons. What my research didn't explain was why the mention of the tunnel seemed to make the locals so uncomfortable, or why the county had apparently gone to the trouble of sealing an abandoned tunnel on what was now private property. Doris returned with my breakfast, eyeing my notes with thinly veiled concern. "You planning to visit the tunnel itself?" I glanced up, surprised by her directness after the earlier deflection. "If possible. I understand it's on private property now." "Pearson land. Old Bill Pearson inherited it when the railroad sold off their holdings. His granddaughter Martha runs the library." Doris hesitated, then lowered her voice. "She's the one to talk to if you're set on this tunnel business. But I'd suggest you look into some of the other historical spots around here instead. The old sawmill's still standing out on County Road 16. Makes for better pictures." Before I could press for more information, Doris moved away to attend to other customers. I ate my breakfast slowly, watching the diner's routine unfold around me. The rain-streaked windows cast a gray light over everything, enhancing the sense that Echo Valley existed in some indeterminate time between past and present. An elderly man at a corner booth kept glancing in my direction, his weathered face lined with what might have been curiosity or concern. Eventually, he paid his bill and, instead of leaving, made his way to the counter and took the stool next to mine. "Here you're asking about the tunnel," he said without preamble. His voice a gravelly rumble that matched his appearance: flannel shirt, canvas work jacket, the deep creases around his eyes suggesting decades spent outdoors. That's right, for a book about abandoned railways. He studied me for a long moment. Name's Frank Ellison. My father worked on that tunnel. One of the lucky ones who finished the job. The phrasing caught my attention. Lucky ones. Frank nodded slowly. 7 men didn't. Tunnel collapse in 30. Official story was a support beam failure, but my father had different ideas. My journalistic instincts, dormant for too long, suddenly stirred. What kind of ideas? Frank glanced over his shoulder, then back at me. Not the kind you discuss in public. If you're serious about this tunnel research, come by my place this afternoon. I'm out on Ridgeline Road, about 3 miles east of town. White house with a red barn. He stood, adjusting his worn baseball cap. Around 4. Supposed to stop raining by then. He left before I could respond, pushing through the diner's door into the gray morning. Doris watched him go, her expression unreadable, then turned to me with a forced smile. More coffee. I declined, paid my bill, and stepped outside into the persistent drizzle. The town's main street was modestly busy despite the weather, locals going about their business with the unhurried pace of a place where time moved differently. I decided to locate the library and speak with Martha Pearson before my meeting with Frank. Echo Valley's library occupied a handsome brick building that had originally been the town's first bank, according to the historical plaque beside its heavy wooden doors. Inside, the space was surprisingly spacious and well-maintained, with high ceilings, polished wooden shelves, and the comforting smell of old books. Behind the circulation desk sat a woman I guessed to be in her 50s, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun, wire-rimmed glasses perched on a narrow nose. She looked up from her computer as I approached. "Good morning. Can I help you find something?" "Are you Martha Pearson?" A flicker of something caution crossed her features. "I am. My name is Jason Carter. I'm researching abandoned railways for a book, specifically the Echo Tunnel. I understand the tunnel is on your family's property now." Martha's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "That's correct. The land was purchased by my grandfather when the railroad company liquidated their assets in this region. I was hoping to get permission to visit the tunnel, take some photographs for my book." "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Mr. Carter. The tunnel was sealed decades ago, and for good reason. It's structurally unsound and dangerous." Her tone was polite but firm, the matter seemingly closed for discussion. "I understand the safety concerns," I pressed, "but even exterior photographs would be valuable for my research, the architectural and historical significance. There are plenty of old railway tunnels across the country that remain accessible." Martha interrupted, her voice cooling. "I suggest focusing your research elsewhere." I'd encountered reluctant property owners before, but Martha's flat refusal seemed excessive for what should have been a routine request. I changed tactics. I'd still be interested in any historical information you might have about the tunnel. Newspaper archives, construction records, anything that might help me understand its significance to Echo Valley's development. Martha hesitated, seeming to weigh her options. Finally, she nodded. "Wedo maintain local historical archives. I can pull the relevant materials for you to review here in the library." She glanced at her watch. "It will take me some time to gather everything. Can you return around 1 this afternoon?" I agreed, thanked her, and decided to use the intervening hours to explore the town. As I turned to leave, Martha called after me. "Mr. Carter, may I ask how long you're planning to stay in Echo Valley?" "Just a few days," I replied. "Enough time to complete my research." She nodded, a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I see. Well, I hope you find what you're looking for." Something in her tone suggested the opposite, and as I stepped back into the rain, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled into a mystery far more complex than the architectural history of an abandoned railway tunnel. The rain finally began to ease as I walked the length of Echo Valley's main street, photographing the handful of historical buildings that remained from the town's brief heyday. The former railway station had been converted into a real estate office, its distinctive architecture still visible beneath modern signage. A plaque beside the entrance noted its construction in 1925, just before the tunnel project began. My wanderings eventually led me to a small town museum housed in what had once been the lumber company's administrative building. A hand-lettered sign indicated limited hours, open Tuesday through Saturday, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., but the door was unlocked despite the early hour. I stepped inside to find a single room filled with glass display cases and framed photographs chronicling Echo Valley's history. A teenage girl sat behind a small desk near the entrance, looking up from her phone with surprise at my arrival. "Oh, sorry, I didn't hear you come in." She straightened in her chair. "Welcome to the Echo Valley Historical Museum. Admission is by donation." She gestured to a jar on the desk labeled "Support Local History." I dropped a $5 bill into the jar. "Not many visitors on rainy weekdays." "Not many visitors ever," she replied with the blunt honesty of youth. "I'm only here because I'm getting community service credit for school." She glanced at my camera. Tourist, writer, working on a book about abandoned railways, including the Echo Tunnel. The girl's expression changed immediately, eyes widening with interest rather than the wariness I'd encountered elsewhere. "The tunnel? Really? That's like the coolest thing about this boring town." "How so?" She leaned forward conspirationally. "It's haunted. Everyone knows it. That's why they sealed it up and why nobody talks about it." She glanced toward the open door, then lowered her voice. "There's this ritual the high school kids do, going into the tunnel at midnight, turning off all lights, standing in total darkness for 7 minutes. You're supposed to hear the dead workers talking, maybe even see their ghosts." It was exactly the kind of local legend that sprung up around tragic industrial accidents. Nothing unusual there. "Have you done this ritual yourself?" She shook her head. "No way. First, my parents would kill me if I trespassed on Pearson land. Second," she hesitated, "a couple years ago, some kids from my brother's class tried it. One of them, Ryan McKenzie, had some kind of breakdown afterward. Started talking weird, acting strange. His parents sent him to a special school in Portland, but everyone knows it was really more like a mental hospital." Before I could question her further, an older woman appeared from a back room, frowning at our conversation. "Amber, I believe you have inventory sheets to complete." The girl sighed and stood up. "Right. Sorry, Mrs. Livingston." She gave me an apologetic look before disappearing into the back room. Mrs. Livingston, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, with a museum volunteer badge pinned to her cardigan, turned to me with a tight smile. "Welcome to our museum. Please feel free to browse the exhibits. We have a fine collection of artifacts from the lumber industry that built our town." "Thank you. I'm particularly interested in the railway history, especially the Echo Tunnel." Her smile froze. "I'm afraid our railway exhibition is quite limited. The company took most of their records when they ceased operations here." She gestured to a small display case in the corner. "We do have some items related to the local station, if that's of interest." The deflection was becoming a pattern, but I thanked her and made my way to the indicated display. The case contained a few unremarkable items: a conductor's hat, a railway lantern, some faded tickets, but nothing specifically related to the tunnel. The photographs on the surrounding walls showed Echo Valley in its prime, streets bustling with activity, the railway station a hub of commerce. One photograph, partially obscured in a corner, caught my attention. It showed a group of men standing at what appeared to be the tunnel entrance, a massive stone archway carved into the mountainside. The men wore the typical work clothes of 1930s construction laborers, their faces solemn beneath cloth caps. What made the photograph unusual was a strange distortion around its edges, a blurring that couldn't be entirely attributed to age or photographic limitations of the era. "Is there any additional information about this photograph?" I asked Mrs. Livingston, who had been hovering nearby, watching my examination of the displays. She glanced at the image and quickly looked away. "Just a construction crew photograph. We have limited documentation on specific workers or projects." "The tunnel entrance is impressive," I persisted. "The stonework looks almost like it incorporates pre-existing structures, rather than being built from scratch." Mrs. Livingston's discomfort was palpable. I wouldn't know about such technical details. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have administrative matters to attend to. She retreated to the back room, leaving me alone in the small museum. I studied the photograph more closely, wishing I could remove it from the wall for a better look. There was something about the tunnel entrance that seemed incongruous with standard railway construction of the period. The stonework had an almost ornate qua, lighty, with patterns that served no obvious functional purpose. I took a few surreptitious photographs of the display with my phone, then continued my examination of the museum's offerings. Nothing else related to the tunnel caught my eye, but I noted the general prosperity evident in the historical photographs and the sharp contrast with Echo Valley's current modest circumstances. By the time I left the museum, the rain had finally stopped, though heavy clouds still hung low over the valley. I checked my watch, nearly noon, with an hour before my appointment at the library and 4 hours until my meeting with Frank Ellison. Enough time for lunch and perhaps a drive along the old railway line to see how close I could get to the tunnel from public roads. The Valley Diner was busier now, the lunch crowd filling most of the booths. I took a seat at the counter again, ordered a sandwich, and pulled out my notebook to review what little I'd learned. The locals' reluctance to discuss the tunnel could be explained by the accident during its construction. Small towns often develop superstitions around sites of tragedy, but something about their reactions suggested more than simple respect for the dead or fear of ghostly encounters. As I ate, I became aware of a conversation in the booth behind me. Two men speaking in the low tones of those who don't want to be overheard. Another outsider asking questions. When will they learn to leave it alone? Martha will handle it. She always does. Until when? The seal is weakening. You know what happened with the Mackenzie boy. That was different. He was inside for too long. This guy's just writing a book, taking pictures. That's how it starts. Curiosity. Then they hear it. The conversation shifted to mundane topics as a waitress approached their table. I kept my posture casual, giving no indication I'd been listening, but my pulse had quickened. What had happened to Ryan Mackenzie? The boy Amber had mentioned at the museum. What seal were they referring to? And what might someone hear in the tunnel? My journalistic instincts, dormant since Fallujah, were now fully awake. There was a story here, something beyond ghost stories and local superstition. I finished my lunch, paid my bill, and headed back to the library for my appointment with Martha Pearson. She was waiting for me with a cardboard box of materials on a reading table in the quiet corner of the library. Her manner remained professional but distant as she explained the contents. These are the documents we have relating to the Echo Tunnel project. Mostly newspaper articles from the Echo Valley Chronicle, some correspondence between the railway company and local officials, and a few photographs. You're welcome to take notes, but these materials cannot leave the library. She hesitated. Mr. Carter, I understand professional curiosity, but I want to be clear. The tunnel itself remains strictly off-limits. The danger is very real. I assured her I understood, and she left me to my research, retreating to the circulation desk where she could keep an eye on me from a distance. The newspaper articles provided a straightforward chronology of the tunnel's construction, from the initial announcement in 1928 to its completion in 1931. The accident that claimed 7 lives was reported in clinical detail. A support beam failure leading to a localized collapse roughly 1/3 of the way into the mountain. The bodies had been recovered and given proper burials in the town cemetery. More interesting were the subtle inconsistencies I began to notice. Reports before the accident frequently mentioned the tunneling proceeding faster than expected due to unusual geological conditions that made the excavation easier than engineers had predicted. After the accident, however, there were references to unexpected obstacles and challenging subterranean features. One report, dated 3 weeks after the accident, quoted the project foreman saying the collapse occurred when workers breached an unexpected cavity within the mountain, a detail not mentioned in the initial accident coverage. The correspondence between the railway company and town officials contained oblique references to special considerations and unique circumstances surrounding the tunnel project, with several letters emphasizing the need for absolute discretion. regarding certain aspects of the construction. Most telling was a letter from the railway's chief engineer to Echo Valley's mayor, dated just after the tunnel's completion. While we celebrate the successful completion of the Echo Pass Tunnel, I must emphasize the critical importance of maintaining the supplementary structures exactly as designed. The acoustical anomalies within the mountain have been addressed through specialized engineering techniques, but any alteration to these systems could result in the recurrence of the unusual phenomena experienced during construction. The ceiling measures at Station 27+40 must remain undisturbed under all circumstances. No further explanation was provided for what unusual phenomena had been experienced or what ceiling measures had been implemented, but the tone conveyed an urgency beyond normal engineering concerns. The photographs were few and mostly unremarkable. Standard documentation of construction progress, workers posing with equipment, political figures at the tunnel's official opening. One image, however, caught my attention, a close-up of what appeared to be unusual markings on a rock wall inside the tunnel. The markings weren't natural geological features, but didn't look like typical construction markings either. They resembled sound waves or vibration patterns, carved into the stone with remarkable precision. The photograph's caption simply read, "Anomalous formations, Station 27+40, not for public release." I was making notes about this image when I noticed Martha watching me intently from her desk. I nodded acknowledgement, and she approached, glancing at the photograph I'd been studying. "Finding what you need for your book." Her tone was conversational, but I could sense her tension. "It's fascinating material," I replied. "I'm particularly interested in these acoustical anomalies mentioned in some of the correspondence. Was Echo Tunnel known for unusual sound properties?" Martha's expression remained neutral, but her hands clasped together more tightly. "Old tunnels often create interesting echoes, hence our town's name. Nothing particularly unusual beyond that." "This photograph," I persisted, pointing to the image of the strange markings, "suggests otherwise. These patterns look almost like mineral deposits," Martha interrupted, "common in this geological area." She began gathering the materials with efficient movements. "I'm afraid we're closing early today for a staff meeting. Is there anything specific you'd like me to set aside for your return visit tomorrow?" The dismissal was transparent, but I thanked her and said I'd review my notes to determine what else I might need. As I stood to leave, a question occurred to me. "Ms. Pearson, does the number 27+40 have any significance in relation to the tunnel?" Her hands froze momentarily in their organization of papers. "It's a standard railway measurement designation. Station 27+40 would be 2,740 feet from the tunnel's starting point." She resumed her movements, not meeting my eyes. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter. The library opens at 9 tomorrow." I stepped outside into a world transformed by the cessation of rain. The late afternoon sun had broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across the town and illuminating the surrounding mountains in a golden light. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, a refreshing change from the musty confines of the library. With 2 hours before my meeting with Frank Ellison, I decided to drive the old railway route and see how close I could get to the tunnel entrance. I returned to the motel to retrieve my car, a practical 5-year-old Subaru that had replaced my impractical New York sports car when I began my cross-country research. Harold watched me from the office window as I got into my car, his expression unreadable behind the reflection of sunlight on glass. I raised a hand in greeting, but he didn't respond, just continued watching as I pulled onto the main road. The old railway line was easy enough to follow, though the tracks had been removed decades ago. The graded bed remained visible, cutting through the landscape in the unnaturally straight line that only human infrastructure achieves. A rural road paralleled the route for several miles outside of town before veering away as the railway bed continued toward the mountains. I followed the road as far as I could, eventually reaching a point where it curved away from the old railway line to skirt around the base of Echo Mountain. I pulled onto the shoulder and consulted my maps. According to my research, the tunnel entrance should be roughly a mile further along the mountain's base, but there was no clear path from my current position. As I sat contemplating my options, a pickup truck slowed as it passed, then pulled in behind me. An older man in a Forest Service uniform stepped out and approached my window. "Car trouble?" he asked, his tone friendly but eyes watchful. "No, just consulting my maps. I'm researching the old railway tunnel for a book." The man's expression shifted subtly. "Echo Tunnel? That's on private property now. Pearson land." "So I've been told. I was just trying to get a sense of its location." He pointed toward the mountain. "Entrance is about a mile that way, but there's no public access. Road ends here." He studied me for a moment. "You're the writer staying at Harold's place." It wasn't a question, but I nodded confirmation. "Word of advice? Folks around here are protective of their history. Some stories they'd rather leave buried." He tipped his hat. "Safe travels back to town. These mountain roads get tricky after dark." He returned to his truck and drove away, leaving me with the distinct impression I'd received another warning. I checked my watch. Time to head to Frank Ellison's place if I wanted answers rather than more deflections and thinly veiled cautions. Ridgeline Road proved to be a winding gravel track that climbed the eastern slope of the valley, offering spectacular views of Echo Valley and the surrounding mountains. Frank's property was exactly as he described, a modest white farmhouse with a red barn, set back from the road on about 5 acres of land that had once been cultivated but now grew wild with native grasses. As I pulled into the driveway, the front door opened and Frank emerged onto the porch. He watched my approach with the same careful assessment I'd received from everyone else in town, but his subsequent nod suggested I'd passed whatever test he'd applied. "Right on time," he said as I climbed the porch steps. "Come in before it starts raining again." The interior of Frank's home was neat but sparse, the furnishings old but well maintained. He led me to a kitchen that looked largely unchanged since the 1970s, gesturing for me to sit at a formica table while he poured coffee from a percolator on the stove. "Sugar? Milk?" he asked. "Black is fine, thanks." He set a mug before me and took a seat on the opposite side of the table, studying me with the same intensity he'd shown in the diner. "So, you want to know about Echo Tunnel?" "I do. Specifically, I want to understand why everyone in town seems so reluctant to discuss it. Even the historical records at the library seem curated." Frank nodded slowly. "Martha Pearson's doing her job. Same job her family's been doing for 3 generations, keeping people away from that tunnel." He took a sip of his coffee. "You've been to that fancy college, I expect. Got degrees and such." "I studied journalism at Columbia, yes." "Then you're trained to look at facts, evidence, things you can prove." Frank leaned forward. "What I'm about to tell you, you can't prove. No pictures, no recordings, no scientific data. Just the experiences of the men who built that tunnel, including my father, and the things that have happened since." I nodded, willing him to continue. "The official story is that Echo Tunnel was built to create a more direct route for the railway, cutting through Echo Mountain instead of going around it. That much is true. What they don't tell you is what they found inside that mountain." Frank's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. The survey team had calculated it would take at least 3 years to bore through, based on the rock composition. But once they started digging, they made progress far faster than expected. Know why? I shook my head. Because about a quarter mile in, they hit a cave system. Natural caverns that nobody knew existed, save the months of blasting and drilling. Frank's eyes held mine. But these weren't ordinary caves. The workers started reporting sounds. Voices coming from deep within the mountain where nobody should be. At first, they figured it was just echoes of their own work, hence the name Echo Valley. But then the voices started saying things the workers couldn't have said. I kept my expression neutral, though internally I was categorizing this as the kind of superstitious tale that often surrounded industrial projects in remote areas during that era. What kind of things? Names of people who weren't there. Events that hadn't happened yet. Conversations and languages nobody on the crew spoke. Frank took another sip of his coffee. My father was a rational man, Mr. Carter. He didn't believe in ghost stories or superstition, but he believed what he heard in that tunnel. And what about the accident? The collapse that killed 7 men. Frank's expression darkened. That wasn't no ordinary collapse. Those men were trying to wall something up. A particular chamber they discovered deep in the cave system, a place where the voices were strongest. The official record says a support beam failed, but my father told a different story. He said those men were taken, pulled into the rock itself. I couldn't hide my skepticism at this dramatic departure from the documented facts. Pulled into the rock. I told you, you won't believe it. I'm not asking you to. I'm just telling you what my father told me. Frank stood and walked to a drawer, retrieving an old envelope. After the accident, they brought in specialists. Not just engineers, but other types of experts. They completed the tunnel but added what they called acoustic dampening features throughout. Special materials in the walls, geometrical designs carved into specific points. He removed a faded photograph from the envelope and placed it before me, like this. The image showed the same wave-like patterns I'd seen in the library photograph, but from a different angle. In this shot, workers were actively carving the designs into the tunnel wall under the supervision of men in suits who didn't look like typical railway engineers. These dampening features, they muffled the voices, made the tunnel safe to use. For a while anyway, but over time, those features degraded. By the 60s, train crews were refusing to go through Echo Tunnel, reported hearing voices in the static of their radios, seeing things that couldn't be there. That's the real reason the railway was abandoned, not economic factors like the official story claims. I studied the photograph, noting details I couldn't explain. The unusual precision of the carvings, the serious expressions of the suited supervisors, the apparent discomfort of the workers. And after the railway was abandoned, Bill Pearson bought the land containing the tunnel. His family had been in Echo Valley since its founding, and they knew the stories. They took on the responsibility of making sure nobody went near that tunnel. County helped by officially sealing the entrance, but that was more to keep people out than whatever was in there. And yet local teenagers still find their way in for this midnight ritual I've heard about. Frank's eyebrows rose. You've been busy today. Yes, there's always some kid looking to prove how brave they are. Most times, nothing happens. They get scared by normal tunnel noises, run home with a good story. But sometimes, he shook his head. Sometimes they hear the real voices, like that Mackenzie boy. What exactly happened to Ryan Mackenzie? I asked, recalling the museum girl's comments and the conversation I'd overheard in the diner. 2 years ago, a group of high school kids broke into the tunnel for the ritual. Ryan was the last one to come out. When he finally did, he wasn't the same. Started talking about acoustic gateways and temporal resonance chambers. Words a 17-year-old has no business knowing. Spoke in languages his parents swear he never studied. Drew those same wave patterns over and over. Frank reclaimed the photograph, returning it to the envelope. They sent him to some special facility in Portland after he tried to break back into the tunnel with explosives, raving about completing the connection. I considered Frank's story, weighing it against my journalistic instincts. There was clearly something unusual about Echo Tunnel, historical discrepancies, the town's collective reticence, the strange patterns in the photographs, but voices from nowhere, people pulled into solid rock, temporal phenomena. These were the stuff of fiction, not reportable fact. Mr. Ellison, I appreciate you sharing these stories with me. There's definitely something intriguing about Echo Tunnel's history, but without access to the tunnel itself, I'm not sure how much I can include in my book beyond the documented facts. Frank studied me for a long moment, then sighed. You want to see for yourself. They always do. He stood, walked to a sideboard, and returned with a folded paper which he placed on the table. This is a map of the Pearson property, including the service roads that maintenance crews used to use. The main entrance is sealed, like I said, but there's a maintenance shaft about half a mile along the tunnel line. Smaller, harder to find, and theoretically sealed as well. But the last major repair was decades ago. I unfolded the map, studying the detailed hand-drawn routes and annotations. Why are you giving me this? Because you'll go looking anyway. Might as well have accurate directions, so you don't trespass on the wrong property and get shot by some paranoid neighbor. Frank's expression was deadly serious. But listen carefully. If you go, when you go, follow the rules of the ritual. No more tea. On 7 minutes inside. No recordings of any kind, no audio, no video, nothing that can capture voices or images. And whatever you do, don't respond if you hear someone calling your name. The conversation had taken a turn I hadn't anticipated, moving from local history to specific warnings about supernatural dangers. Part of me, the rational, journalistic part, wanted to dismiss Frank's concerns as superstition. But another part, perhaps the part that had been irreparably changed by my experiences in war zones, recognized the genuine fear behind his warnings. "I'll be careful," I promised, folding the map and tucking it into my jacket pocket. "One more thing," Frank said as I stood to leave. "If you do hear them, the voices, there's a reason they're trapped in there. Remember that before you start feeling sorry for them." The sun was setting as I drove back to town, painting the valley in deep oranges and purples. Frank's warnings echoed in my mind, competing with my professional curiosity and the momentum of investigation. I had come to Echo Valley seeking a simple story about an abandoned railway tunnel. What I'd found instead was a mystery that defied conventional explanation. Back at the motel, I spread my notes and the map on the bed, trying to make sense of the scattered pieces of information I gathered. The library documents, the museum photograph, Frank's stories. They pointed toward something beyond ordinary history, something I couldn't quite grasp but felt compelled to understand. I knew I should wait, gather more information in town before attempting to visit the tunnel. But Frank was right. I would inevitably want to see for myself. And now I had a map showing me exactly how to do that. The rational decision would be to wait until morning, to approach the tunnel in daylight with proper equipment and safety precautions. But as I studied the map, calculating distances and estimating hiking times, I realized that waiting meant giving the town, particularly Martha Pearson, more opportunity to discover my intentions and potentially block my access. The decision crystallized with surprising speed. I would go tonight, not for the full ritual experience, but simply to document the tunnel's exterior, perhaps glimpse inside if the maintenance shaft was indeed accessible. I would take photographs, notes, measurements, all the practical documentation I needed for my book, and leave the supernatural aspects of Echo Tunnel's reputation unexplored. I repacked my backpack with essentials, a powerful flashlight, spare batteries, my camera, a first aid kit, water, energy bars, and the map. On impulse, I added my digital voice recorder, not to capture supernatural voices, which I still regarded as local legend, but to record my own observations as I explored. By 9 p.m., full darkness had settled over Echo Valley. I waited another hour, giving the town time to quiet down for the night before slipping out to my car. Harold's office was dark, the motel quiet except for the distant sound of a television from one of the occupied rooms. I drove with only parking lights until I was well outside of town, following the main road before turning onto a barely visible Forest Service track indicated on Frank's map. After about 2 miles, the track became too rough for my Subaru, and I pulled off into a small clearing, concealing the car as best I could among the trees. From there, it was a hike of approximately a mile through dense forest, following the dotted line on Frank's map by flashlight. The night was cool but not cold, the rain having given way to a clear sky filled with stars. An owl called somewhere nearby, and small creatures rustled in the undergrowth as I passed. The maintenance shaft, according to the map, was located on a slight rise overlooking the main tunnel line, disguised within a natural rock formation. I would have missed it entirely without Frank's precise directions. A rectangular outline cut into the stone, now partially obscured by decades of vegetation growth. The metal door that had once secured the shaft was still in place, but was badly rusted, its padlock broken, possibly by previous explorers seeking the thrill of the tunnel ritual. It took considerable effort to pull the door open, the hinges protesting with a screech that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. Beyond lay a vertical shaft with metal rungs embedded in the concrete wall, descending into darkness. I played my flashlight beam down, but couldn't see the bottom. The air that wafted up from the opening was cool and damp, carrying a faint mineral smell and something else, a subtle metallic tang that reminded me, uncomfortably, of blood. Standing at the threshold, Frank's warnings suddenly seemed less like superstition and more like practical advice. What was I doing, preparing to descend into an abandoned tunnel alone at night, based on a hand-drawn map from a man I'd just met? This wasn't professional research. It was recklessness born of the same impulse that had once sent me into active combat zones with only a camera for protection. And yet, I needed to know. Not just the facts about Echo Tunnel that would fill a paragraph in my book, but the truth behind the town's collective silence, the strange patterns in the photographs, the acoustic anomalies that had so concerned the railway's chief engineer. I checked my watch, 11:17 p.m. Not quite the midnight hour of the ritual, but close enough to add an atmospheric element to my exploration. I secured my backpack, tested the nearest rung for stability, and began my descent into Echo Tunnel. The shaft descended about 30 feet before opening into a horizontal passage. This secondary tunnel was narrower than the main railway bore would be, likely designed for maintenance workers to access critical areas without disrupting train operations. The concrete walls were damp with seepage, and decades of neglect had resulted in small stalactites forming on the ceiling. I played my flashlight along the passage, which extended in both directions. According to Frank's map, the left fork would lead toward the sealed main entrance, while the right would take me deeper into the mountain, eventually connecting with the main tunnel at approximately the location of the infamous Station 27+40 mentioned in the library documents. Common sense dictated taking the left fork, a shorter distance, likely safer given its proximity to the outside world. But the reference to Station 27+40 had lodged in my mind, combined with the image of those wave-like patterns carved into the tunnel walls. Before I'd fully rationalized the decision, I found myself turning right, moving deeper into the mountain. The maintenance passage was relatively straight and level, though I had to duck in places where the ceiling had partially collapsed. My flashlight beam caught glints of mica in the rock walls, creating brief sparkles in the darkness. The silence was profound. No dripping water, no scurrying animals, not even the subtle sounds of air movement that usually pervade underground spaces. After walking for perhaps 10 minutes, I noticed a change in the tunnel's character. The rough-hewn maintenance passage gave way to a more finished section, with smooth concrete walls marked at regular intervals with faded numerical designations. I had reached the main railway tunnel. I consulted Frank's map, confirming my location. I was indeed approaching Station 27+40, the area of specific concern in the historical documents. The main tunnel was impressively large, designed to accommodate freight trains carrying massive lumber shipments. My flashlight beam couldn't reach the full height of the arched ceiling, creating the unsettling illusion that the tunnel opened into infinite darkness above me. As I moved forward, I began to notice distinctive patterns on the walls, not the natural geological features of the mountain, but deliberate modifications to the tunnel's structure. At regular intervals, the concrete lining had been molded into subtle wave-like forms, similar to those I'd seen in the photographs, but more extensive than I'd imagined. These patterns covered entire sections of the tunnel walls, creating what I now recognized as acoustic baffles, designed not to support the tunnel structurally, but to modify how sound waves move through the space. I stopped to photograph these features, fascinated by their sophisticated design. These weren't crude adjustments made by 1930s railway engineers. They resembled modern acoustic treatments found in high-end recording studios or concert halls, executing complex mathematical principles that wouldn't be fully developed until decades after the tunnel's construction. As I lowered my camera, I became aware of a subtle change in the tunnel's atmosphere. The air felt heavier, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up, and there was a sound, barely perceptible at first, like the distant hum of electrical equipment or perhaps wind finding its way through some unseen opening. I checked my watch. I'd been inside the tunnel for nearly 20 minutes, far longer than I'd intended. The sensible course would be to photograph the immediate area and retreat, returning in daylight if necessary. But the hum was oddly compelling, drawing me forward toward what appeared to be a significant change in the tunnel's architecture. Approximately 50 feet ahead, The regular curve of the railway tunnel was interrupted by what looked like an alcove or chamber cut into the side wall. The opening was framed by particularly elaborate acoustic patterns, these more precisely carved than those along the main passage. The humming seemed to emanate from this chamber, growing subtly louder as I approached. I should have remembered Frank's warnings at this point. I should have noted the time, taken a few final photographs, and begun my return journey. But journalistic curiosity, the same quality that had made me effective in my former career and had nearly killed me in Fallujah, propelled me forward. The chamber was roughly circular, perhaps 15 feet in diameter, with addomed ceiling. Unlike the main tunnel with its practical concrete lining, this space had been finished with fitted stone blocks, each carved with variants of the wave patterns I had observed throughout the tunnel. The overall effect was like standing inside a three-dimensional representation of sound itself: frozen ripples, captured echoes, solidified acoustic phenomena. The center of the chamber featured a raised stone platform that resembled an altar or perhaps an instrument panel, though it contained no obvious controls or devices. The humming was definitely stronger here, vibrating subtly through the soles of my boots. I placed my hand on the stone platform, surprised to find it warm to the touch despite the cool air of the tunnel. I set my backpack down and took out my voice recorder, intending to document my observations of this unusual space. As I pressed the record button, the humming abruptly intensified, jumping several decibels in volume. Static burst from the recorder speaker, not the normal electronic interference, but a structured static that rose and fell in patterns that almost, but not quite, resembled speech. Startled, I nearly dropped the device. The moment the recorder activated, something in the chamber had responded. I switched it off, and the humming immediately returned to its previous subtle level. This was not coincidence or equipment malfunction. There was some direct interaction between my recording device and whatever energy existed in this space. Despite mounting unease, my curiosity compelled me to experiment further. I turned the recorder on again, and again the humming surged, static filling the chamber. This time I held my ground, listening intently to the patterns within the noise. There was structure there, rhythms and modulations that suggested language rather than random interference. "Hello," I said, feeling slightly foolish speaking to empty air. "Is someone trying to communicate?" The static shifted, coalescing around certain frequencies while abandoning others. Within the noise, I could almost discern words, almost, but not quite. Then, with startling clarity, a single word emerged. "Jason." My name. My actual name. Not a sound that could be mistaken for something similar. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. A perfect neutrality that seemed more unsettling than any identifiable human voice could have been. I switched off the recorder immediately, heart pounding. The chamber returned to its previous state, the humming once again a subtle background presence. I glanced at my watch. I'd been inside the tunnel for 32 minutes, far longer than the ritual's 7-minute limit. Frank's warning echoed in my mind. Don't respond if you hear someone calling your name. But I already had, simply by acknowledging the communication. And now that I had, would ignoring it make any difference? Professional detachment warred with primal fear as I stood in that chamber, weighing my options. The rational explanation would be that the recorder had picked up radio frequencies, perhaps from a distant station, and my mind had imposed familiar patterns onto random noise. Or perhaps the chamber's unusual acoustics had captured and distorted my own voice when I spoke. But I didn't believe either explanation, not truly. Something in this chamber had responded to my technology, had identified me by name. And now that the initial shock was fading, I found myself needing, to understand what it was. I raised the recorder again, finger hovering over the button. Before I could press it, however, my flashlight flickered, once, twice, then stabilized. The battery was still good. I had checked it before entering the tunnel. This was something else. The humming in the chamber incrementally increased, not in response to my recorder this time, but independently. The stone platform beneath my hand grew warmer, and I noticed that the carved patterns on the walls seemed to be subtly changing, not physically moving, but somehow shifting in perspective, as though I was seeing them from different angles simultaneously. My watch showed 11:54 p.m. Almost midnight, almost the hour when, according to local legend, the tunnel was at its most active, when the boundary between worlds was thinnest. I wasn't a superstitious man. I didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena, but I believed in evidence and observation, in the reality of what I experienced with my own senses. And my senses were telling me that something extraordinary was happening in this chamber, something that defied conventional explanation. With a journalist's instinct for documenting the unprecedented, I pressed record once more. The reaction was immediate and far more intense than before. The humming surged into a roar, the static from the recorder becoming so loud it was painful to my ears. The patterns on the walls seemed to vibrate, no longer mere carvings, but active, dynamic forms that pulsed with internal light. And voices, dozens of voices now, speaking simultaneously in multiple languages, creating a cacophony of sound that somehow retained structure, as though conforming to rules I couldn't comprehend. Within the chaos, I could occasionally distinguish words or phrases in English. Connection established. Temporal reflection stable. Observer confirmed. Jason Carter, journalist, present time. They knew me. Not just my name, but my profession. My presence here wasn't unexpected. It was anticipated. The flashlight flickered again, more severely this time, and I became aware of movement at the edges of the chamber. Not physical movement of objects, but a disturbance in space itself, as though the boundaries of the room were becoming undefined, permeable. The stone walls appeared to recede in places, revealing glimpses of somewhere else, or perhaps someone else, as impossible as that seemed. Through these spatial distortions, I caught fragmentary images. Men in 1930s work clothes, operating equipment I didn't recognize. Suited figures with measuring devices pointed at the chamber walls. A teenage boy, Ryan McKenzie, writing frantically in a notebook, his eyes wide with the same mixture of terror and fascination I now felt. The recorder in my hand grew hot, the plastic casing beginning to deform. I dropped it to the stone platform, where it continued to emit its staticky cacophony. My flashlight dimmed further, the beam weakening as though the very light was being absorbed by the chamber's growing distortions. I needed to leave. Whatever was happening here was escalating, and I had no framework to understand it, no way to predict what might come next. I grabbed my backpack, turned toward the chamber entrance, and froze. Standing in the doorway was a figure, human in general outline but wrong in every detail, proportions slightly off, movements too fluid or perhaps too jerky, face visible but somehow unreadable, as though my mind couldn't properly process what my eyes were seeing. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the chamber's noise. The figure tilted its head at an angle no human neck should permit. When it spoke, its mouth didn't move in synchronization with the words, creating a disorienting disconnect between visual and auditory perception. "We are echoes," it said, its voice containing the same neutral quality as the one that had spoken my name. Reflections caught between moments, vibrations that should have dissipated but instead were trapped. Trapped? Here in the tunnel? Not in. By. The figure gesticulated with two long fingers. The tunnel was built to contain us, to prevent resonance cascade. My journalistic instincts pushed through the fear, seizing on this new information. You were here before the tunnel? In the mountain. We were everywhere. Everywhen. Frequency beings traveling wave paths through reality. This location was a node, a convergence point where multiple wave paths intersected. We gathered here. Then humans came, breached our chamber, created dissonance. The implications were staggering. These entities, weren't ghosts of dead workers or supernatural creatures from folklore. They were something else entirely, something that existed alongside our reality but separate from it, perceivable only under specific conditions. The acoustic dampening features, I said, understanding dawning. They were designed to contain you, to prevent your frequencies from expanding beyond the tunnel. Yes, the figure's form fluctuated, briefly revealing others behind it, dozens, perhaps hundreds of similar entities, all partially visible through the spatial distortions that continued to widen. They feared what they did not understand, feared resonance with human consciousness. What happens during resonance? The figure's approximation of a face formed what might have been a smile. Information transfer, memory exchange, consciousness expansion beyond temporal limitations. The teenage boy-eyed glimpsed Ryan Mackenzie, his strained behavior after visiting the tunnel, speaking languages he'd never learned, discussing complex acoustic principles beyond his education. He had experienced this resonance, this information transfer. "You're trying to communicate," I said, pieces falling into place. "You're not malevolent entities. You're just different life forms trying to interact with humans." Yes and no. The figure's voice took on a new quality, multiple tones speaking in unison, creating a chord rather than a single note. Communication is destructive to unprepared minds. Your thought structures are linear, temporal. Ours are not. Complete resonance overwhelms human consciousness, fragmenting identity. I thought of Frank's warnings, of the town's protective silence, of Martha Pearson's family guarding the tunnel for generations. They weren't superstitious. They were pragmatic. They understood, at least partially, what had been contained here. "Why did you say my name? Why call to me specifically?" The figure wavered, its outline blurring further. "You are receptive, modified by trauma. The experience you call Fallujah restructured your consciousness, created potential for partial resonance, without destruction." My blood ran cold. How could this entity know about Fallujah, about the IED, about the psychological damage I'd sustained? Unless it had accessed my memories somehow, read my mind without my awareness. The implications were terrifying. If these entities could access human memories simply through proximity, what else might they learn from an unprepared visitor? What other effects might they have on human consciousness? My recorder suddenly emitted a high-pitched whine, a plastic casing now fully melted into the stone platform. The spatial distortions in the chamber walls pulsed in time with the sound, expanding with each cycle. The figure in the doorway multiplied, splitting into overlapping versions of itself, like a visual echo. "Midnight approaches," the many-voiced chorus announced. "The node activates. Will you join the resonance, Jason Carter? Will you expand beyond temporal limitations?" I looked at my watch, 11:59 p.m. 1 minute until the hour when, according to local legend, the tunnel was at its most dangerous. 1 minute until whatever was happening in this chamber reached its peak. What happens if I join the resonance? I asked, even as I inched backward, seeking another exit that didn't exist. You become more, less, different. The figures spoke in perfect synchronization, their forms now completely overlapping. You will hear all voices across all times. You will know what has been and what will be. You will exist beyond linear progression. And if I refuse, then leave now. Return to your limited perception, your linear existence. But know that once offered, resonance cannot be untaken. You will hear echoes for the remainder of your life. Fragments of our communication will reach you in moments of silence. You will know we are here, waiting. The chamber's humming reached a crescendo, the patterns on the walls now fully animated, flowing like liquid sound given visual form. My flashlight dimmed to almost nothing, the beam swallowed by the increasing distortions in the air. I had seconds to decide. Stay and experience whatever resonance meant, potentially losing myself in the process, or flee. Return to the surface world, but forever changed by what I'd witnessed. The journalistic impulse urged me to stay, to document the unprecedented, to understand these entities and their relationship to our world. The survival instinct screamed for retreat, for escape from forces I couldn't comprehend or control. In the end, it was Frank's warning that tipped the balance. If you do hear them, the voices, there's a reason they're trapped in there. I turned and ran, pushing past the fluctuating figure in the doorway, feeling a sensation like static electricity as I moved through its indistinct form. The tunnel beyond was now different, the concrete walls rippling as though viewed through heat waves, distance impossible to judge accurately, direction seeming to shift with each step. Behind me, the voices called in harmonic discord. You cannot truly leave. You have begun the resonance. We will echo in your mind. I ran blindly, my faltering flashlight providing only occasional glimpses of the path ahead. The tunnel seemed longer than it had before, stretching impossibly before me. My breathing came in ragged gasps, each inhalation bringing the metallic taste of the chamber's energy into my lungs. Finally, after what seemed like hours, but could only have been minutes, I saw the maintenance shaft ahead, the metal ladder leading up to the night sky visible as a darker patch in the general gloom. I scrambled toward it, half expecting to feel spectral hands grabbing at me from behind, but nothing pursued me, nothing physical at least. The climb up the ladder was the most difficult physical task I'd ever undertaken, each rung requiring conscious focus as my mind reeled from what I'd experienced. At the top, I collapsed onto the forest floor, gasping the clean night air, looking up at stars that now seemed impossibly distant and cold. I don't remember the hike back to my car or the drive to the motel. The next clear memory I have is sitting on the edge of the bed in my room, still fully dressed, as dawn light filtered through the thin curtains. My camera and backpack were beside me, but the voice recorder was gone, left behind, melted into the stone platform in that impossible chamber. In the clear light of morning, I should have been able to rationalize what I'd experienced, to attribute the voices to acoustic tricks, the visions to oxygen deprivation, or perhaps gas pockets in the tunnel, the entity to hallucination brought on by stress and my pre-existing PTSD. But my rational mind offered no such comfort. I remembered everything with perfect clarity. The chamber, the patterns, the voices calling my name, the figure's impossible anatomy, its knowledge of my past, its offer of resonance. And I could still hear them, faintly, at the edge of perception, like a radio playing too quietly to make out specific words, but loudly enough to know it's there. The voices from the tunnel, whispering in the static of my thoughts. The entities had told the truth about one thing, once offered. The resonance could not be untaken. I had not accepted their invitation to fully join whatever consciousness collective existed in that chamber, but I had not escaped unmarked either. I should leave Echo Valley immediately, drive away, never return, try to forget what I'd seen and heard. But I know I can't do that. The journalist in me, the seeker of truth that survived Fallujah and all that came after, won't allow it. There are questions that need answers. What exactly are these frequency beings? How long have they been interacting with humans? What happened to Ryan McKenzie and others who experienced full resonance? What is the true purpose of the acoustic dampening features? And who designed them with knowledge that shouldn't have existed in the 1930s? I came to Echo Valley, seeking a simple story about an abandoned railway tunnel. What I found instead was a doorway to understanding that might reshape our conception of reality itself. The knowledge that we share our world with entities that exist in dimensions of sound and time rather than conventional space. Entities that can access our memories, influence our thoughts, perhaps even alter our fundamental nature. As I write these words, the voices whisper at the edges of my awareness, not threatening, not overtly malicious, but constant, persistent, waiting for moments of silence to slip through the cracks in my consciousness. They brought me to Echo Valley. They guided me to the tunnel. They wanted to be found, to be heard, to be understood. And now that I've heard them, I can never unhear them again. The echoes are part of me now, resonating in the spaces between thoughts, between moments, between heartbeats. I will stay in Echo Valley. I will research further. I will seek answers. And in the silence between my questions, the voices will whisper theirs in return. Fragments of self. There's a unique kind of terror in waking up and not knowing who you are. Not the dramatic amnesia of fiction, where characters forget their names, but retain their personality and skills. I'm talking about the profound horror of looking inside yourself and finding pieces missing, core memories, emotional responses, the fundamental experiences that shape a human being. I awoke in a sterile hospital room 3 weeks after the Michigan incident. The white ceiling, the rhythmic beeping of monitoring equipment, the antiseptic smell, all painfully ordinary. But I wasn't ordinary anymore. Whatever had happened in that forest, whatever price I'd paid to close the breach, had fundamentally changed me. Sam, Grace's voice, cautious with hope. I turned my head to see her sitting beside the bed, dark circles beneath her eyes, suggesting she'd been there for days. Are you? A strange question, but I understood her concern. After what we'd seen the architects do to people, how they could hollow out a human and wear them like a suit, her caution was warranted. Mostly, I replied, my voice a dry rasp from disuse. There are gaps. Grace helped me sip water through a straw, her movements careful, professional, a wartime nurse tending to the wounded soldier. Only after I'd drunk did she allow herself to touch my hand, fingers intertwining with mine in a rare display of emotion. The doctors can't explain why you're alive, she said quietly. The neurological damage should have been fatal. Your brain showed activity patterns they've never seen before, regions lighting up that shouldn't even be active in a conscious human. I wasn't surprised. The memories of those final moments in Michigan remained crystal clear, even as older memories had become hazy or disappeared entirely. I remembered the cauterizer activating, the breach beginning to close, the architect's desperate final assault on my consciousness. I remembered feeling myself fracturing, consciousness splintering under their attack. And I remembered what came after, the intervention from beyond conventional reality. My father and Alex somehow reaching across dimensional boundaries to hold the fragments of my identity together. I died, I said with certainty. For a while, anyway. Grace's expression tightened, but she didn't contradict me. She'd seen too much in our years fighting interdimensional entities to dismiss anything outright. 6 minutes and 37 seconds with no detectable neural activity, she confirmed. Then everything just restarted. The medical team is calling it a miracle. Not a miracle, I said. Dad and Alex, they brought me back. Grace's eyes glistened, but she blinked away tears with practiced control. The network has been monitoring all 7 sites. The heptagram is definitely broken. Whatever the architects were planning, we stopped it. Temporarily, I clarified, struggling to sit up. My body felt simultaneously weightless and impossibly heavy, as if parts of me existed in different gravitational fields. We disrupted their primary incursion vector, but they'll adapt. Find another approach. Sam, you need to rest. Recovery first, then. How long was I unconscious? I interrupted. 3 weeks, she replied. We've had you under constant observation, both medical and... She hesitated, dimensional. Natalie designed sensors to monitor for any signs of architect influence or contamination. And I prompted, already knowing the answer. You're clean, as far as we can tell, but changed. She hesitated again. Your brainwave patterns don't match your previous baselines, and there are other anomalies we can't explain. As if on cue, the lights in the room flickered. I felt a strange resonance inside my head, as though something were vibrating at a frequency just beyond human perception. Grace noticed my expression and immediately reached for a device on her belt, a personal dimensional anchor, standard equipment for network operatives since Michigan. It's happening again, she asked, activating the device. A subtle field of normalized physics expanded around us, and the strange resonance in my head immediately diminished. Less intense this time, I assured her. How often has this been occurring? Randomly at first, but with increasing regularity over the past week. Electronic disturbances within approximately 20 feet of you. The effect is subtle enough that most people attribute it to normal power fluctuations, but our instruments detect interdimensional energy signatures, similar to what we recorded at the breach sites. The implications were both fascinating and terrifying. Something had changed in my fundamental nature during those 6 minutes and 37 seconds of clinical death. Some part of me had been altered by my journey beyond conventional existence, and that alteration was manifesting physically in the world around me. I need to see Dr. Martinez, I said, attempting once more to sit up. This time Grace helped me, adjusting the bed to a seated position. She's just outside, Grace replied. She's been coordinating your medical care with a small team cleared for witness network intelligence. No one else knows what really happened in Michigan. Dr. Elena Martinez entered moments later, her familiar stern expression softening slightly when she saw me conscious. She'd been with the network since the early days of our conflict with the Collector, one of the few medical professionals in the world with experience treating interdimensional contamination. Against all medical probability, "You're back with us," she said, checking my vital signs with experienced efficiency. "How's the pain level?" I hadn't even noticed until she mentioned it, but now I became aware of a persistent ache throughout my body, most intense in my head, not sharp or acute, but deep and pervasive, as though it originated from somewhere beyond my physical form. "Manageable," I replied, "but there's something else. Something wrong." Dr. Martinez nodded, unsurprised. "Your neurological structure has been fundamentally altered. We've recorded activity in brain regions that shouldn't be possible in a living human. Your posterior cingulate cortex, which normally deactivates during focused attention, is continuously active. Your pineal gland shows unprecedented metabolic activity, and your corpus callosum has developed new neural pathways connecting hemispheres in ways we've never seen before." She showed me brain scans on her tablet, my altered neuroanatomy highlighted in comparison to baseline scans from before Michigan. The changes were dramatic even to my untrained eye. Entire regions reorganized, new connections formed, patterns of activity that looked more like abstract art than the human brain. "What does it mean?" Grace asked, though I suspected she already knew. "His brain has adapted to process information beyond normal human sensory inputs," Dr. Martinez explained. "It's as if new sensory organs have developed at the neural level, capable of perceiving something else." "Dimensional variance," I supplied, the term appearing in my mind fully formed. "I can sense fluctuations in dimensional stability, places where the boundaries between realities are thinner or under stress." Both women stared at me, and I realized I'd used terminology that didn't exist in conventional science. The knowledge had simply been there, accessible as naturally as remembering my own name, though I couldn't identify its source. "There's more," I continued, compelled to share what I somehow knew. "The architects weren't destroyed when we closed the breach. Their physical manifestations were disrupted, but their consciousness exists across multiple dimensional planes. They're regrouping, adapting their approach." "How do you know this?" Grace asked carefully. I touched my temple, wincing at a sudden spike of pain. "I can feel them, not directly communicating like before, but I'm aware of their presence, their activities. It's like hearing a conversation from several rooms away. I can't make out the words, but I can tell they're still talking." Dr. Martinez made notes on her tablet, her clinical demeanor unable to fully mask her concern. "And these perceptions, are they constant or intermittent?" "Stronger at certain times. When I'm tired, when my guard is down, when I'm near places with natural dimensional instability." I paused, realizing something else. "They're strongest during REM sleep. I've been having dreams, except they're not really dreams. More like glimpses through windows into other realities." Grace and Dr. Martinez exchanged glances, a silent communication born from weeks of discussion about my condition while I was unconscious. "We need to run more tests," Dr. Martinez said finally. "Your condition is unprecedented, but if you're receiving information about the architect's activities, that could be strategically valuable for the network." "Or dangerous," Grace added. "If you can sense them, they might still be able to sense you, use you as a vector for another incursion attempt." She was right, of course. The connection that had formed between my consciousness and the architects, while damaged during the Michigan confrontation, might not be completely severed. It could represent both an intelligence asset and a security vulnerability. "I need to see the cauterizer," I said suddenly, another fragment of knowledge surfacing from somewhere in my altered mind. "Where is it?" "In secure storage at network headquarters," Grace replied. "It was completely drained after Michigan, dimensions fractured in multiple places. The engineering team doesn't think it can be repaired." "It doesn't need repair," I said with certainty. "It needs recalibration. The dimensional mathematics have shifted since we closed the breach. The multiverse is rebalancing, seeking new equilibrium points. We need to adapt our technology accordingly." I swung my legs over the side of the bed, ignoring Dr. Martinez's protests. The room swayed alarmingly, and black spots danced at the edges of my vision, but I remained upright through sheer determination. "Sam, you're in no condition to leave," Dr. Martinez insisted. Your body is still recovering from catastrophic neurological trauma. I don't have a choice, I replied, looking directly at Grace. Something's coming. Something worse than the architects. They were just the advanced party, testing our dimensional defenses, identifying weaknesses. The real threat is still gathering strength. What real threat? Grace asked, her tactical mind immediately engaging despite her concern for my health. What do you mean? Worse than the architects? I struggled to articulate concepts that existed in my mind as pure understanding rather than verbal constructs. The architects were desperate, seeking survival for their civilization. What's coming next is predatory. It doesn't want to survive. It wants to consume, to devour consciousness itself across multiple realities. Even as I spoke, I felt a chill of recognition. This knowledge hadn't come from nowhere. It had been planted in my mind during those 6 minutes and 37 seconds of clinical death, when my father and Alex had reached across dimensional boundaries to preserve my consciousness. The Devourer, I whispered, the name surfacing from the depths of my altered memory. That's what Dad called it, a metaconsciousness that feeds on dimensional collapse events. It's drawn to the energy released when pathways between worlds are forcibly closed. Grace paled visibly. You're saying our actions at Michigan created a beacon, I confirmed grimly. We did exactly what we needed to do to stop the architects, but in doing so, we sent a signal rippling across dimensional boundaries. The Devourer has noticed our reality now, and it's hungry. Dr. Martinez stepped between us, her expression resolute. This discussion can continue after you've undergone proper medical evaluation. Whatever interdimensional threat may be approaching, you'll be no use against it if you collapse from pushing your recovery too quickly. She was right, of course. My body was trembling from the simple effort of sitting upright, sweat beading on my forehead. The strange resonance in my head had intensified, and the lights in the room were flickering more rapidly now. 24 hours, I conceded. Run your tests. But then we need to get to network headquarters. We need to prepare. Grace nodded, helping me lie back down. I'll arrange secure transport and brief the core team, if what you're saying is accurate. It is, I assured her. I wish it wasn't. As Dr. Martinez administered a mild sedative through my fore, I felt myself drifting toward unconsciousness again. But this time, I was aware that sleep would not bring restful darkness. Instead, it would open those windows again, glimpses into other dimensions, other realities, where something vast and hungry was turning its attention toward our world. And somewhere, in the spaces between conventional existence, my father and Alex were watching, waiting, perhaps planning their own countermoves in a game played across the entirety of the multiverse. The last thing I remember before the sedative took effect was Grace's hand squeezing mine, her voice steady despite the fear I knew she must be feeling. We've faced impossible odds before. We'll face them again. I wished I could share her confidence, but as consciousness faded, I felt the looming presence of the Devourer, not a discrete entity like the architects, but a vast, diffuse intelligence spread across countless realities, drawn inexorably toward the dimensional wound we had created at Michigan. And it was hungry, so very, very hungry. Dreams are different now. Not the random firings of a resting brain, not the processing of daily experiences and emotions. My dreams have purpose, direction, content that couldn't possibly originate from my own mind. Tonight, I dream of a city unlike any on Earth. Towers of crystalline material that bend light in impossible ways. Streets that curve through more dimensions than humans can perceive. Inhabited by beings that exist as patterns of light and information rather than physical matter. I recognize this place despite never having seen it before. The architect's home dimension, or some preserved memory of it before the entropy cascade that drove them to seek refuge in our reality. The city is beautiful in its alien complexity, in the mathematical precision of its structures, in the harmony of its design across dimensional planes. But something is wrong. The crystalline towers are developing fractures, the carefully ordered streets beginning to distort. The light-pattern beings move with increasing urgency, their communications taking on a frequency that translates in my dream perception as fear. At the edges of the city, darkness gathers, not the absence of light, but something more fundamental, the absence of possibility itself. Where this darkness touches, reality simply ceases, leaving not even void behind. The devourer, consuming the architect's dimension just as it now turns its attention to ours. I watch, a disembodied observer, as the magnificent city is gradually consumed. The architects fight back with technologies beyond human comprehension, generating fields of stabilized reality, erecting barriers of probability manipulation, even sacrificing portions of their collective consciousness to create dimensional buffers. None of it works. The darkness advances inexorably, patient and implacable. It doesn't rush, doesn't need to. Entropy always wins in the end. The devourer is simply entropy weaponized, given purpose and direction by some cosmic accident in the earliest moments of the multiverse's formation. As the last towers fall and the final light patterns flicker out, I feel myself being drawn elsewhere, pulled through layers of reality toward another scene, a laboratory of some kind, recognizable as human-made but with technology decades beyond our current capabilities. Scientists around a containment chamber within which swirls a miniature vortex of darkness, a tiny fragment of the devourer, somehow captured and constrained for study. One scientist approaches the chamber, adjusting controls, increasing power to the containment field. Something goes wrong. Alarm sound. The darkness within the chamber pulsates, expands, breaches containment. The scientist screams as it touches him, his body not disintegrating but transforming, becoming a vessel for something that should not exist in our dimensional plane. Other scientists flee, sealing the laboratory, initiating emergency protocols. But it's too late. The possessed scientist interfaces with computer systems, uploads something into the global network. A digital seed that will grow, spread, create dimensional microfractures throughout our world's information infrastructure. Preparing the way. The scene shifts again, and I am in a familiar setting, the central chamber of the Michigan facility where we deployed the cauterizer. But this isn't a memory. The facility is intact, the breach above it closed, but still visible as a scar in reality itself. And standing before this scar is a figure I recognize despite never having seen him before. My father, Frank Burnett. Not as I remember him from childhood, but as he exists now. A form composed of light and information rather than flesh. A consciousness freed from physical constraints, yet still recognizably, unmistakably him. "Sam," he says, his voice reaching me directly as thought rather than sound. "We don't have much time. The barriers between sleeping and waking minds are thin here, but not indefinitely stable." "Dad," I manage, my dream self responding in kind. "Is this real?" "As real as anything," he replies with a familiar half-smile, "just operating on a different set of physical principles. Listen carefully. The information I've been sending through your dreams has been fragmented, incomplete, defense mechanism against detection. But now we need to accelerate your understanding." He gestures, and the space around us transforms into a three-dimensional map of interconnected points of light, a representation of the multiverse too complex for a waking human mind to comprehend, but somehow perfectly clear to my dreaming consciousness. The devourer isn't a singular entity, my father explains. It's a process, a pattern that repeats across dimensional boundaries. When a reality collapses, whether through natural entropic decay or forced closure, it creates a specific energy signature. This signature attracts components of the devourer, drawing them like sharks to blood and water. He indicates a dark spot spreading across multiple connected points on the map, dimensions already consumed, their energy harvested, their conscious inhabitants absorbed into the devourer's expanding awareness. The Michigan incident created a beacon, as you've already intuited, but it also created something else, a dimensional echo that resonates with your specific consciousness. That's why you perceive what others can't. That's why your brain has restructured itself to process multidimensional information. You're literally in tune with the frequencies of dimensional transfer. So I'm what, some kind of interdimensional antenna? I ask. More than that. Another voice joins in, and Alex Connolly appears beside my father, his form similarly composed of light and information. "You're a bridge, Sam. partially existing in multiple realities simultaneously. It's why you survived when conventional medicine says you shouldn't have. Parts of your consciousness were preserved across dimensional boundaries, even when your physical brain temporarily ceased functioning. The implications are staggering, terrifying. Am I even human anymore? Definitions of humanity are more flexible than most people realize. My father says gently, "You're you, Sam, just with expanded perception, expanded potential. And right now, that expansion might be the only thing that gives our reality a fighting chance." The map zooms in on Earth, highlighting 7 points, the locations of the original heptagram created by the architects. The Devourer uses existing weaknesses, Alex explains. The points where the architects attempted to breach will be its first targets. The dimensional fabric is already compromised there, easier to penetrate. But we close those breaches. I object. The cauterizers sealed them. Sealed but not healed, my father clarifies. Think of it as scar tissue, stronger in some ways than the original, but still a marker of damage. The cauterizer didn't restore dimensional integrity. It created a bandage of stabilized space-time. That bandage is holding, but the Devourer has means of unpicking such crude repairs. Then what do we do? I ask, frustration mounting. If the cauterizer isn't enough. It was never designed to be a permanent solution, Alex interrupts. It was emergency field medicine when interdimensional surgery was required. What you need now is a more sophisticated approach, not just closing breaches, but actively repairing dimensional integrity. My father moves his hand through the map, creating ripples of light that spread and stabilize the threatened points. You need to create a dimensional restoration network, a system that doesn't just prevent incursion, but actively strengthens the fabric of reality itself. How? I demand. The cauterizer was already beyond our technology, only possible because of the knowledge you shared through dreams. This sounds exponentially more complex. It is, my father acknowledges, but you have advantages we didn't account for. Your altered neurological structure allows you to perceive and manipulate dimensional frequencies directly. With proper training, you could become a human tuning fork, resonating with and reinforcing dimensional boundaries. That's why we brought you back, Alex adds. Not just because we couldn't bear to lose you, though that was part of it, but because you're uniquely positioned to become a guardian against what's coming. The map zooms out again, showing the dark pattern of consumption spreading across dimensions, approaching ours from multiple vectors simultaneously. How much time do we have? I ask. Less than you'd hope, more than you might fear, my father answers cryptically. The Devourer moves between dimensions at a pace dictated by laws of physics beyond conventional understanding. But our best estimate gives you approximately 3 months before the first significant incursion attempts. 3 months to develop technology beyond anything humanity has ever created, to prepare defenses against a threat most people couldn't even conceptualize. The task seems impossible. You won't be fighting alone, Alex says, apparently reading my thoughts. We're gathering allies, other consciousnesses that exist beyond conventional dimensional constraints, entities with their own reasons to oppose the Devourer. Some you might call gods, others demons, still others simply advanced beings who evolved beyond physical form. Labels don't matter. Survival does. And there are others like you, my father adds. Humans whose consciousness has been altered by exposure to dimensional anomalies. Not many, but enough to form a core group with the necessary perceptual abilities. The Witness Network has encountered some already, without fully understanding what they were seeing. This is overwhelming. Too much information to process even in the expanded awareness of my dream state. But beneath the fear and doubt, I feel something else stirring: purpose. A clarity of mission that transcends personal concerns. What's the first step? I ask, straightening my dream self's posture. My father and Alex exchange glances, a silent communication passing between them. You need to find the others like you, my father says finally. 7 individuals whose consciousness has been altered by dimensional exposure. Together, you'll form a human counterpart to the architect's heptagram, not for invasion, but for protection. The network has files on unusual survivors. I note, thinking aloud. People who walked away from dimensional incursions with inexplicable abilities or perceptions. We classified them as contaminated but stable. Start there, Alex confirms. But be cautious. The Devourer has agents in your reality already. Humans who've been touched by fragments that crossed over during previous consumption events. They may appear normal but serve its interests, often without even realizing they're being influenced. How will I identify them? I ask, how do I know who to trust? Your altered perception will help, my father explains. Those touched by the Devourer have a distinctive dimensional signature, a void pattern where normal consciousness should exist. It's subtle, but with practice, you'll learn to see it. The dream landscape begins to flicker, the connection becoming unstable. My father's form wavers, his voice growing fainter. We're out of time, he says urgently. The dimensional window is closing. Remember, Sam, find the 7. Create the restoration network. Trust your new perceptions, but verify with technology. The cauterizer components can be repurposed as detection equipment. And Sam, Alex adds as both their forms begin to fade, be careful who you trust with the full truth. The witness network has been infiltrated. Not everyone who fights monsters remains fully human in the process. Wait, I call out as they disappear. How do I contact you again? How? But they're gone, and the dream collapses around me, reality splintering into fragments of light and darkness. I feel myself falling, tumbling through layers of consciousness back toward the waking world. The last thing I hear is my father's voice, distant but clear. We'll find you in the spaces between. Just listen for us in the static. I awoke with a gasp, sitting upright so suddenly that monitoring equipment toppled beside my hospital bed. The room was dark except for the glow of screens, suggesting late night or early morning. My heart raced, blood pounding in my ears, consciousness still half caught in the vivid reality of the dream. Except it wasn't just a dream. The knowledge it contained felt solid, integrated into my understanding as if I'd studied it for years. I could recall every detail of the multiversal map, every nuance of the Devourer's nature, every instruction my father and Alex had given me. Most importantly, I knew what I needed to do next. The door to my room opened, light from the hallway silhouetting a familiar figure, Grace, apparently alerted by the disruption to my monitoring equipment. Sam, what happened? She asked, crossing quickly to my bedside. We need to access the network's files on dimensional contamination survivors, I said without preamble. All cases where subjects showed altered perception or unusual abilities following exposure events. Grace studied my face in the dim light, concern evident in her expression. Another dream? More than that. Direct communication. Dad and Alex explained what's happening, what's coming. The Michigan breach was just the beginning, Grace. There's something worse approaching, something that makes the architects look like a minor threat in comparison. I explained what I'd learned about the Devourer, about the need to find others with altered consciousness, about the plan to create a dimensional restoration network. With each revelation, Grace's expression grew more troubled. This is a lot to process, she said finally. And while I don't doubt your experience felt real, we need to consider the possibility that your altered neurological state is creating these scenarios internally. You think I'm hallucinating? I asked, unable to keep the edge from my voice. I think we need to be cautious about acting on information received through channels we don't fully understand, she replied diplomatically. I've seen too many entities use false visions to manipulate humans. She had a point. In our years fighting interdimensional threats, we'd encountered numerous cases of entities implanting visions or thoughts to serve their own purposes. The Collector had been particularly adept at such manipulations, creating perfect replicas of trusted figures to deliver convincing lies. Fair enough, I conceded. So we verify. The dreams mentioned that components from the cauterizer could be repurposed as detection equipment. If that proves true, if I can build something with capabilities we didn't have before, would that be enough evidence to proceed? Grace considered this, her tactical mind evaluating contingencies. It would be a start. But Sam, there's something else we need to discuss. She hesitated, then continued carefully. Dr. Martinez's tests revealed some concerning developments in your condition. The neurological changes are accelerating, particularly in regions associated with identity and personality integration. A chill ran through me. What are you saying? She's concerned about potential dissociative effects, that your sense of self might begin to fragment as your brain continues to rewire itself to accommodate multidimensional perception. She took my hand, her touch uncharacteristically gentle. In simple terms, she's worried you might lose yourself, become someone or something else entirely. The possibility had occurred to me, though I hadn't wanted to acknowledge it. I already experienced moments of disconnection, periods where my perception shifted so dramatically that I felt more like an observer of reality than a participant in it. And there were the knowledge fragments that appeared fully formed in my mind, concepts I couldn't possibly have learned through conventional means. All the more reason to work quickly, I said firmly. If my original personality is going to be compromised anyway, let's make use of whatever abilities I've gained while I'm still me. Grace didn't look convinced, but she nodded reluctantly. I'll arrange transport to network headquarters tomorrow morning. Dr. Martinez wants to conduct one more set of tests before clearing you for travel. She checked her watch. Try to get some rest. Real rest, if possible. After she left, I lay back down, staring at the ceiling as my thoughts raced. The warning about the witness network being infiltrated troubled me deeply. The network had been our primary defense against interdimensional threats for years. A carefully constructed global organization built on shared knowledge and trust. If elements within it had been compromised, I closed my eyes, not expecting sleep to return, but exhaustion pulled me under despite my racing mind. This time, no interdimensional communications disturbed my rest, just the normal darkness of dreamless sleep, a mercy I hadn't experienced in weeks. Morning brought Dr. Martinez with her final battery of tests, cognitive assessments, neurological response measurements, detailed brain scans. I cooperated fully, understanding the importance of establishing baselines for my rapidly evolving condition. The results, as expected, showed continued deviation from normal human parameters. Your brain is still restructuring itself, Dr. Martinez explained as we reviewed the latest scans. The process appears to have slowed somewhat, but it's definitely continuing. Most concerning is the unusual activity in your prefrontal cortex and temporal lobes, regions associated with personality and memory integration. Any predictions on the outcome? I asked, studying the colorful images of my altered brain. She shrugged slightly, a gesture at odds with her usually precise demeanor. We're in uncharted territory. No human has ever experienced this specific type of neurological restructuring before. Based on current trends, you'll likely experience further enhancements in pattern recognition, mathematical processing, and possibly extrasensory perception of quantum-level phenomena. And the downsides. Her hesitation told me everything I needed to know before she even spoke. Potential dissociation from normal human emotional responses, difficulty relating to conventional human experiences, possibly even fragmentation of core identity as your perception becomes increasingly multidimensional. In other words, I might stop being human in any meaningful sense of the word, become something else, something beyond conventional definition, neither fully here nor there, caught between dimensions just as my father and Alex now existed. How long? I asked simply. Impossible to say with certainty. At the current rate of change, perhaps 6 months before significant personality alterations become unavoidable. 6 months. 3 months before the Devourer's first major incursion attempts. According to my father, the timing felt deliberate, cosmic irony at its finest. Just as I might complete the work necessary to save our dimension, I would cease to be the person who began it. Then let's not waste time, I said, climbing out of the hospital bed with more strength than I'd had the previous day. My body was recovering rapidly, even as my mind continued its strange evolution. I'm ready to travel. Transport to network headquarters had been arranged with typical Grace-level thoroughness. A private medical helicopter to avoid commercial air travel security. A cover story involving experimental treatment for a rare neurological condition, and a small team of network operatives disguised as medical staff to provide security during transit. As we lifted off from the hospital's helipad, I gazed down at the city below, struck by how ordinary everything looked. People going about their daily lives, completely unaware of the interdimensional threat gathering on the borders of our reality, blissfully ignorant that the fate of not just their world, but potentially countless others might hinge on the work of a small group of dimensionally altered humans. I envied their ignorance, briefly, then remembered why we fought so hard to preserve it. The Witness Network had always operated on the principle that humanity wasn't ready for full disclosure about interdimensional entities and threats, that such knowledge, widely distributed, would cause more harm than good. Mass panic, religious crises, societal breakdown, all distinct possibilities if the average person suddenly learned that reality was far more complex and dangerous than they'd ever imagined. So we worked in the shadows, a small group of people who'd seen too much to ever return to normal lives, sacrificing our own peace of mind to protect the collective sanity of humanity. And now, it seemed, I would be sacrificing even more, my very identity, my fundamental humanity, for the same cause. Was it worth it? The question lingered as we flew toward network headquarters, toward whatever future awaited me there. I had no answer yet, but I suspected I would discover one, for better or worse, in the months ahead. As the helicopter began its descent toward the Witness Network's concealed compound in the mountains of western Wyoming, I steeled myself for the challenges to come, finding the other dimensionally altered humans, repurposing the cauterizer components, creating technology beyond anything Earth had ever seen, and all while racing against two clocks simultaneously, the approach of the Devourer and the dissolution of my own humanity. No pressure, right? The first fragment, Witness Network headquarters, resembled nothing so much as a high-end corporate retreat, a sprawling complex of modernist buildings nestled in a wooded valley, solar panels and satellite dishes, the only hint of the advanced technology within. From the air, it looked peaceful, disconnected from the existential threats we monitored and confronted daily. As our helicopter touched down on the landing pad, I saw familiar faces waiting. Natalie Chun, our field operations director, Marcus Way, head of security, and Dr. Eliza Chambers, our lead dimensional physicist, who had joined the network after the collector incident destroyed her previous research team. The core leadership, minus Grace, who had traveled with me. "Welcome back to the land of the living," Natalie said as I descended from the helicopter, her attempt at levity undermined by the concern in her eyes. "You had us worried." "Still not entirely convinced I am back," I replied with a weak smile. "At least, not all of me." The formalities were brief. Medical staff whisking away my limited belongings, security conducting standard contamination scans despite Dr. Martinez's assurances that I was clean of architect influence. No one quite knew what to make of my transformed neurological state, and caution had kept the network alive through years of interdimensional encounters. In the main briefing room, a space I knew well from countless strategy sessions, the core team gathered to hear my report. I explained everything, the dreams, the communications from my father and Alex, the warnings about the Devourer, the need to find 7-dimensionally altered humans and create a restoration network. Throughout my explanation, expressions around the table shifted from concern to skepticism to alarm. When I finished, silence hung heavy in the air. "Let me get this straight," Marcus finally said, his security background evident in his controlled skepticism. "A metaconsciousness that feeds on collapsed dimensions is now targeting our reality because we closed the breach at Michigan. And to fight it, we need to find 7 people with brains rewired by dimensional exposure, yourself included, to build some kind of reality reinforcement system." Put that way, it sounded absurd, but I nodded anyway. "That's the essence, yes. And this information comes from dream communications with your deceased father and Alex Connolly, both of whom now exist as non-corporeal consciousnesses in some interdimensional space," he continued flatly. "I understand how it sounds," I acknowledged. "If I hadn't experienced it myself, I'd be just as skeptical." Dr. Chambers leaned forward, her scientific curiosity overriding any doubts. The dimensional math could potentially support such a theory. If we consider reality as a fabric with varying tension points, Then forced closure of a breach would indeed create ripple effects across adjacent dimensional planes. Those ripples could, theoretically, attract entities sensitive to such disturbances. Theory is one thing, Natalie pointed out. Betting our entire operational focus on information received through dreams is another. We need verification, which is why I want to examine the cauterizer components, I said. According to the communications, they can be repurposed as detection equipment. If that proves true, if I can build something with capabilities we don't currently possess using knowledge I couldn't have acquired conventionally, wouldn't that lend credibility to the rest of the information? Grace, who had remained silent until now, nodded. It's a reasonable test case, and given what we've already seen of Sam's altered cognitive functions, I believe we should pursue this line of investigation, albeit cautiously. That was Grace, ever the pragmatist, weighing risks against potential benefits, keeping emotion out of strategic decisions, even when those decisions involved someone she cared about deeply. The cauterizer is in secure storage, she continued. I'll authorize access. Dr. Chambers can assist with any technical requirements. Actually, I said carefully, I'd prefer to work alone initially. The process will involve intuitive elements that might be difficult to explain in conventional scientific terms. What I couldn't say openly given my father's warning about network infiltration, was that I needed to conduct a test of my own, to determine if I could identify those potentially influenced by the devourer using my altered perception. Dr. Chambers looked disappointed but nodded. I'll make sure you have everything you need. Just record your process as thoroughly as possible for scientific documentation. Of course, I agreed, knowing I would selectively edit such documentation. Until I knew who to trust, partial transparency was the safest approach. The meeting concluded with a series of practical arrangements. Living quarters assigned, medical monitoring protocols established, security clearances adjusted to account for my potentially unstable condition. Throughout the discussions, I found myself studying each person present, trying to discern any sign of the void pattern my father had mentioned as a marker of the devourer's influence. Nothing obvious presented itself, but then he'd said it would be subtle, requiring practice to identify, and my abilities were still developing, still unpredictable in their manifestation. Later that evening, alone in the laboratory space assigned for my work, I finally confronted what remained of the cauterizer. The device looked like it had been through a war, which, in a sense, it had. Its once sleek housing was cracked and scorched, dimensional coils warped from the massive energy discharge, quantum processor visibly damaged. To any conventional engineer, it would appear beyond repair. But as I studied it, I began to see differently. My perception shifted, vision overlaying with something beyond normal sight. Patterns of energy still lingering in the components, dimensional frequencies embedded in the very structure of the materials. Not broken, but transformed, evolved. I placed my hands on the device and closed my eyes, focusing on these lingering energies. Something resonated between us, the altered structures in my brain somehow compatible with the dimensional frequencies captured in the cauterizer's components. Information flowed, not as conscious thought, but as direct understanding. When I opened my eyes again, I knew exactly what needed to be done. My hands moved with confident precision, disassembling the device, reconfiguring components, repurposing systems in ways that would have seemed nonsensical to anyone with conventional engineering knowledge. Hours passed in a state of flow so complete I lost track of time entirely. When a knock at the laboratory door finally broke my concentration, I realized it was nearly 3 a.m. Grace entered, carrying coffee and looking exhausted herself. "I figured you'd still be working," she said, setting the mug beside me. "Making progress." I gestured to the workbench, where the cauterizer had been transformed into something new, a handheld device resembling a sophisticated scanner, with a neural interface adapted to my specific brainwave patterns. "It's finished," I said, somewhat surprised myself at how quickly the work had progressed. A dimensional resonance detector. It can identify weak points in reality's fabric, potential breach locations, and I hesitated before adding, individuals whose consciousness has been altered by dimensional exposure. On either side. Grace asked, frowning. Those altered by entities like the architects or the collector, and those potentially influenced by the devourer. I picked up the device, feeling its weight. It works by amplifying the perceptual abilities I've developed, using my own altered neural patterns as a baseline for comparison. Grace studied me carefully. You built this in one night, with no reference materials, based on knowledge you received in dreams. Yes, I admitted. I know how it sounds. It sounds like either definitive proof that your dream communications are genuine, or evidence that your cognitive alterations have progressed to the point of spontaneous knowledge generation. She sighed, rubbing her temples. Neither possibility is particularly comforting from a security standpoint. Which is why we need to test it, I said, gesturing to the device. If it works as designed, if it can identify what conventional sensors can't, then we have reason to trust the other information about the devourer. Grace nodded slowly. What do you need for testing? Access to the network's files on dimensional exposure cases, particularly survivors who exhibited unusual abilities or perceptions afterward. And I hesitated, then committed to the request. I want to scan current network personnel, discreetly. Her expression sharpened instantly. You suspect infiltration. I met her gaze directly. Dad and Alex warned that the network has been compromised, that some within our ranks may be influenced by the devourer, possibly without even knowing it. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. We'd worked alongside these people for years, trusted them with our lives on numerous occasions. The thought that any of them might be unknowingly serving an interdimensional predator was disturbing on multiple levels. If true, that represents a critical security breach, Grace said finally, her voice dropping to near whisper despite the lab's secure status. But scanning personnel without their knowledge raises ethical concerns, not to mention potential panic if discovered. Which is why I'll start with volunteers, I suggested. Present it as a baseline study of dimensional exposure effects, using myself as the primary subject, but seeking comparison data. Grace considered this, then nodded. I'll be your first volunteer then. Right now. She gestured to the device. Scan me. I hesitated. Grace, I haven't tested it yet. I don't know exactly how it. If you're asking the network to trust this technology, to make strategic decisions based on its readings, then you need to be confident in its function. She interrupted. And I need to know if I've been compromised without realizing it. So scan me, Sam. She was right, of course. I activated the device, feeling the neural interface connect with my altered consciousness, expanding my perception beyond normal parameters. Through this technologically enhanced awareness, I could see Grace differently. Not just her physical form, but layers of something like informational architecture that constituted her core consciousness. The pattern was beautiful in its complexity. Billions of neural connections, emotional contexts, memories, all interwoven into the unique structure that was Grace Burnett. And critically, I saw no void patterns, no signs of external influence or dimensional contamination. Just Grace, completely herself. Relief washed through me as I deactivated the device. You're clean. No signs of influence or alteration. The tension visibly drained from her shoulders. Thank you. That's more reassuring than I expected. She glanced at the device, then back to me. How does it feel? The scanning process. Strange, I admitted. Like seeing someone's soul, for lack of a better term. Not their thoughts or memories specifically, but the architectural pattern of their consciousness. What makes them uniquely them? And you could tell if that pattern had been altered, influenced by something like the devourer. I nodded. According to what I saw in the dreams, the devourer's influence creates distinctive void points in consciousness, places where normal human awareness has been hollowed out and replaced with something else. The detector amplifies my ability to perceive those patterns. Grace took a deep breath, decision made. I'll arrange for voluntary scanning of key personnel, presented as you suggested. In the meantime, I'll pull the files on documented dimensional exposure survivors. If we're looking for 7 individuals with altered consciousness, that's our starting point. Thank you, I said sincerely. I know this isn't easy to accept. Nothing about our work ever is, she replied with a tired smile. Get some rest, Sam. Tomorrow we start identifying your dimensional dream team. Sleep, when it finally came, was mercifully dreamless. No interdimensional communications, no visions of the Devourer's advance. Just the simple unconsciousness my exhausted mind desperately needed. When I awoke, a tablet on my bedside table contained the first batch of files Grace had promised. 23 cases of individuals who had survived direct contact with dimensional anomalies and subsequently exhibited unusual abilities or perceptions. I spent the morning reviewing them, looking for patterns that might identify the specific type of consciousness alteration my father had described. Most were familiar cases from our years of operation, people who had encountered fragments of the Collector or similar entities and walked away changed in ways we could observe but never fully explain. Enhanced intuition, precognitive dreams, the ability to sense electronic communications without technological interfaces, various manifestations of expanded perception, though none as dramatic as what I now experienced. 7 cases stood out as particularly promising. 7 individuals whose reported abilities suggested fundamental alterations to consciousness rather than simply enhanced normal human perception. One, Mira Patel, survived a Collector manifestation in Mumbai, afterward demonstrated the ability to perceive probabilistic outcomes, describing them as ghost images, overlaying reality, potential futures visible as semi-transparent versions of events that hadn't yet occurred. 2, David Chun, Eliza Chen's younger brother, present during the quantum wave incident that claimed Alex's life, subsequently developed what he called echolocation, the ability to sense the presence and emotional states of people he'd previously met, regardless of physical distance. 3, Sophia Williams, theoretical physicist whose research into quantum computing accidentally opened a micro breach in her laboratory. After exposure to whatever came through, she began experiencing time nonlinearly, perceiving past, present, and future events simultaneously in what she described as overlapping layers of now. 4, James Harper, former military, part of a classified operation to investigate a dimensional anomaly in the Arctic. The only survivor of his team, he returned with the ability to perceive what he called the spaces between, gaps in physical reality where other dimensions pressed close to our own. 5, Leon Nakamura, a teenager who survived an encounter with a Collector fragment that had manifested through her school's computer network, afterward developed the ability to mentally interface with electronic systems, describing digital information as having dimensional layers invisible to normal perception. 6, Dr. Victor Reyes, neurologist who self-experimented with a device designed to stimulate pineal gland function, accidentally creating a temporary dimensional breach in his laboratory, claimed to subsequently perceive frequency patterns in human speech that revealed truth or deception on a fundamental level beyond conscious control. 7, Hannah Moore, a painter who disappeared for 3 days after entering an abandoned subway tunnel reported to be a manifestation site. Upon her return, she could no longer speak verbally but could communicate through art that seemingly depicted dimensional spaces beyond normal human perception. 7 individuals with 7 distinct but complementary forms of altered consciousness. The pattern seemed too perfect to be coincidence, aligning precisely with what my father had described. These were the people we needed for the Dimensional Restoration Network, assuming they were still alive, still sane, and willing to participate in something that would sound utterly delusional to anyone without direct experience of interdimensional entities. I was still reviewing the files when Grace entered my quarters, her expression revealing news before she spoke. "We've completed preliminary scanning of volunteer personnel," she said, closing the door behind her. 37 individuals so far, including all department heads and field team leaders. "And," I prompted, setting aside the tablet, 35 show no signs of external influence," she reported. 2 presented irregularities in their consciousness patterns according to your detector, Dr. Eliza Chambers and Marcus Way. The names hit me like physical blows. Both were core team members. Both had been with the network for years. Both had proven their dedication through numerous crisis situations. If they had been compromised, what kind of irregularities? I asked, needing specifics before jumping to conclusions. Different patterns for each, Grace replied, sitting heavily in the chair opposite me. Dr. Chambers shows what you might describe as fragmentary voids, small, disconnected points scattered throughout her consciousness structure. Marcus presents a more centralized pattern, a single void region located specifically in areas your detector associates with decision-making and loyalty. I processed this information, correlating it with what I'd learned from my father. The patterns suggest different levels of influence. Dr. Chambers may be in early stages, perhaps unconsciously receiving information or subtle nudges, rather than direct control. Marcus, I hesitated, the implications disturbing. The centralized pattern suggests more deliberate infiltration, possibly targeting specific behavioral aspects while leaving the rest of his consciousness intact to avoid detection. Are you suggesting Marcus has been, possessed? Grace's skepticism was evident despite everything she'd seen in our years with the network. Not possession in the traditional sense, I clarified. More like targeted consciousness modification. The Devourer doesn't need complete control, just enough influence to affect key decisions at critical moments, like a sleeper agent programmed to activate under specific circumstances. Grace rubbed her temples, the security implications clearly overwhelming. What do we do? Confront them? Restrict their access? We have protocols for contamination scenarios, but nothing that addresses this specific situation. I thought carefully before responding. We need more information before taking action. The detector identifies altered consciousness patterns, but can't determine specific intentions or awareness. It's possible, even likely, that neither of them knows they've been influenced. So we watch them, Grace concluded. Limit their access to critical information about the Devourer and your project without making it obvious. We're doing so. Yes, and I need to test the 7 individuals I've identified from the exposure case files. I gestured to the tablet. If they show the specific type of dimensional alteration we're looking for, that further validates both the detector and the information from my dreams. Grace picked up the tablet, scanning the highlighted files. I recognize most of these names. Witness Network has maintained monitoring protocols for all known exposure survivors. Current locations should be in the database. We need to bring them in, I said, discreetly, voluntarily if possible, but urgently. That won't be simple, Grace cautioned. These individuals have experienced trauma most people can't comprehend. Many have spent years trying to forget what happened to them, rebuild normal lives. Normal ended for them the moment they were exposed, I replied, perhaps too harshly, just as it did for us. Now they're needed for something beyond themselves. Grace studied me, concern evident in her expression. You're talking about them like resources, tools to be utilized rather than people with autonomy. The observation struck uncomfortably close to home. Was I already losing touch with human empathy, seeing people as components in an interdimensional equation rather than individuals with their own lives and choices? The possibility disturbed me deeply. You're right, I acknowledged. We approach them honestly, explain the situation, offer choices, but make the stakes clear. She nodded, apparently satisfied with this adjustment. I'll begin location confirmation and contact protocols. But Sam, she added, eyes meeting mine directly. We proceed carefully with Dr. Chambers and Marcus. If they've been influenced as you suspect, direct confrontation could trigger unpredictable responses. I agreed, though the thought of working alongside people potentially serving the Devourer's interests, however unwittingly, left me deeply unsettled. Trust had always been the network's foundation. We faced horrors together that would break most humans, relied on each other when reality itself seemed to unravel. Now that foundation was cracked, and I couldn't help wondering what other fractures might be spreading through our organization undetected. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. While Grace coordinated the complex logistics of locating and approaching our 7 candidates, I continued refining the dimensional detector, expanding its capabilities based on insights that continued to surface from my altered consciousness. The device evolved under my hands, becoming more sensitive, more precise in its readings. I also began designing prototype components for the dimensional restoration network, working from conceptual models that appeared in my mind with increasing clarity. The underlying principles defy conventional physics, operating on theories of reality that wouldn't be discovered by mainstream science for decades, perhaps centuries. Yet I understood them intuitively, my altered neural structure somehow compatible with these advanced concepts. It was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying, accessing knowledge beyond human development while feeling my own humanity slowly slip away in the process. The effects of my neurological transformation became more pronounced daily. Ordinary conversations grew increasingly difficult as I perceived layers of information beyond words, subtle dimensional frequencies in voices, probability patterns in casual statements, the complex architecture of consciousness behind seemingly simple interactions. I found myself withdrawing from communal spaces, the overwhelming sensory input from multiple consciousnesses gathered in one location becoming nearly unbearable. Only Grace could still approach me without triggering waves of disorienting perception, perhaps because I'd grown accustomed to her specific consciousness pattern, or perhaps because something deeper than alter neurology still recognized and welcomed her presence. On the fourth day, the first of our candidates arrived at headquarters, Mira Patel, the probability perceiver from Mumbai. Security protocols were modified to accommodate her unique situation, official status as a consultant rather than a potential asset or threat, quarters adjacent to mine rather than in the standard visitor wing, briefing materials that included more classified information than would typically be shared with outsiders. I met her in a small conference room designed for sensitive discussions, deliberately minimalist to reduce potential perceptual distractions for both of us. My first impression was of a woman with extraordinary self-possession, petite mid-30s, with intelligent eyes that seemed to focus slightly above and beyond whatever she looked at, as if constantly tracking something invisible to others. "Ms. Patel," I greeted her, extending my hand. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." She studied me for a moment before accepting the handshake, her gaze shifting subtly as if seeing multiple versions of me simultaneously. "You're not quite what I expected, Dr. Burnett. Your probability field is unusual, fragmented." The casual observation confirmed what the files had suggested. Her ability to perceive probabilistic outcomes was genuine and apparently automatic. I activated the dimensional detector, which I'd modified to be less conspicuous, resembling a conventional tablet with specialized sensors. What I saw through its enhanced interface was stunning. Myra's consciousness pattern showed distinct alterations similar to my own, but with a unique configuration focused in regions associated with temporal perception and predictive modeling. She wasn't just seeing probabilities. Her consciousness had been reorganized to perceive time itself differently, as branching possibilities rather than linear progression. "May I ask what you're seeing when you look at me?" I asked, genuinely curious about how her perception compared to mine. "Multiple versions of you, overlapping," she replied without hesitation. "Some more solid than others, suggesting higher probability outcomes. The version speaking to me now is somewhat unstable, fluctuating between states of being." She tilted her head slightly. "There are versions where you are much less human than you appear currently, and versions where you are not present at all. The matter-of-fact description of my potential futures, including ones where I either transcended humanity entirely or ceased to exist, sent a chill through me." "And what about yourself?" I asked. "Do you see your own probability field?" A shadow crossed her face. "Constantly. Every decision branches into visualized outcomes, some trivial, others." She trailed off, then continued more softly. "It's why I isolated myself. Too much information, too many potential futures crowding my perception. Medication helps dull it somewhat, though your Ms. Burnett insisted I skip today's dose for this meeting." "For good reason," I confirmed. "Your ability, your altered consciousness, is exactly why you're here. You're one of 7 individuals whose perception has been fundamentally changed by dimensional exposure. Together, you may be crucial to preventing something worse than what you encountered in Mumbai." I explained about the Devourer, about the need for a dimensional restoration network, about the specific pattern of 7 differently altered consciousnesses working in concert. Throughout my explanation, Mira nodded occasionally, as if confirming information she'd already considered. "You're not surprised," I observed when I finished. "I've seen this conversation in my probability field for months," she explained. "A low probability outcome that gradually strengthened until it became nearly inevitable. I've had time to process the possibility." She looked at me directly. What I couldn't see clearly was whether agreeing to help would lead to survival or extinction. That node remains clouded. "Because the outcome isn't determined yet," I suggested. "It depends on decisions not yet made, factors still in flux." "Perhaps," she allowed, "or perhaps some outcomes exist beyond my ability to perceive. Since the incident, I've learned there are limits to what my altered consciousness can process. Boundaries that, when approached, create a kind of perceptual static." The description resonated with my own experience. Areas of interdimensional understanding that remained just beyond reach. Knowledge that formed and then scattered before I could fully grasp it. "Will you help us?" I asked directly. "Join the network? Work with the others once we've gathered them?" Mira was silent for a long moment, her gaze shifting slightly as if scanning through probability branches. Finally, she refocused on me. "In the versions of this conversation where I refuse, you continue your work without me. The probability of success decreases by approximately 23%. In versions where I agree," she hesitated, "the outcomes become too varied to quantify, but the potential for something beyond mere survival exists in some branches." "That sounds like a yes," I ventured. "It's a yes," she confirmed with the ghost of a smile. "But with a condition. After this is over, if there's an after, I want your help understanding what happened to me. Not just living with these perceptions, but comprehending why and how my consciousness was altered." "Agreed," I said without hesitation. "That's a core part of this project. Not just using your abilities, but understanding the fundamental nature of consciousness alteration." As Mira settled into her quarters, Grace brought news that David Chun, Eliza Chen's younger brother with the emotional echolocation ability, had also agreed to come. The others were proving more difficult to contact or convince, but progress was being made on all fronts. "There's something else," Grace added, her expression troubled. "Dr. Chambers has been asking questions about your project. Specific questions about the dimensional detector technology and your interest in exposure survivors." "Has she accessed any restricted files?" I asked, immediately concerned. "Not that we can detect, but her behavior has changed subtly since the scanning. More focused on your activities, more interested in the retrieval of the 7 candidates." Grace lowered her voice despite the room's security. "I've implemented the containment protocols we discussed. Her system access has been quietly restricted. Her lab work subtly redirected to non-critical projects." "And Marcus?" "No obvious behavioral changes, but he's requested assignment to the security detail for the remaining candidate retrievals. I've denied the request with plausible operational justifications." I nodded, appreciating Grace's methodical approach to the potential security threat. "We need to accelerate the timetable. The fact that both compromised individuals are showing increased interest in the project suggests the Devourer may be aware of our countermeasures." "How is that possible?" Grace asked. "If they're unconsciously influenced rather than directly controlled." "Information flows both ways," I explained. "The void patterns in their consciousness aren't just areas of influence, they're connections. What they perceive, what they learn about our activities, could be accessible to whatever is on the other end of those connections." The implication hung heavy between us. If the Devourer was already monitoring our preparations through unwitting human proxies, our timeline might be even shorter than my father had estimated. The race to gather the 7 and build the restoration network had suddenly become more urgent. As if confirming my fears, the lights in the room flickered, not the subtle fluctuation that typically accompanied my perceptual shifts, but a pronounced disruption that affected the entire electrical system. Emergency backups engaged automatically as the main power failed completely. "System-wide outage," Grace reported, checking her secure communicator. No external breach detected, no physical damage to infrastructure. But I knew better. I could feel it. A pressure building against the fabric of reality itself. A presence testing our defenses from beyond conventional dimensions. The Devourer wasn't waiting for its opportunity. It was creating one. It's starting, I said, the dimensional detector in my hand registering massive spikes in interdimensional energy. The first incursion attempt. 3 months early. The timing couldn't be coincidence. Somehow, the Devourer had detected our countermeasures and accelerated its timetable. We had expected months to prepare. Now we might have only days or even hours. As alarm systems throughout the compound activated and personnel rushed to emergency stations, I shared a look of grim determination with Grace. Whatever came next, we were drastically underprepared. 5 of our 7 consciousness-altered candidates were still scattered across the globe. The Dimensional Restoration Network existed only as theoretical designs. Our understanding of the Devourer's capabilities remained frustratingly incomplete. But we had no choice but to face what was coming with whatever resources we had available. Because if the Devourer breached our reality completely, there would be no second chances, no recovery, no future for humanity or any other consciousness in our dimension. The hunt had begun, and this time we were the prey. The fracturing. The Witness Network's headquarters resembled a high-end corporate retreat center more than a base for interdimensional defense operations. A cluster of modernist buildings nestled in a remote Wyoming valley, surrounded by pine forests and mountains that provided both natural beauty and security through isolation. To the casual observer, it might appear to be nothing more extraordinary than a wellness center for wealthy executives or perhaps a private research facility. Only those with the highest security clearance knew that beneath the unassuming surface buildings lay a vast subterranean complex, laboratories, containment facilities, dimensional monitoring stations, and archives containing information too dangerous for conventional storage systems. The kind of knowledge that, in digital form, might attract unwanted attention from entities that move through electronic networks as easily as humans walk through doorways. As our helicopter touched down on the landing pad, I felt a curious sensation, a subtle vibration in my mind that hadn't been present during the flight. Something about this location resonated with my altered consciousness, creating an effect similar to standing near powerful speakers, playing music at a frequency just below human hearing. Something wrong? Grace asked, noticing my expression as we disembarked. There's something here, I replied quietly. Something dimensionally active. I can feel it. Grace nodded, unsurprised. The entire facility is built over a natural dimensional thin spot, a location where the barriers between realities are naturally more permeable. That's why the original network founders chose this site. Easier to monitor incursions where they're most likely to occur. This was news to me, though it made strategic sense. Is it stable? Has been for the 40 years we've been monitoring it. We have containment fields surrounding the entire complex, multi-layered dimensional anchors, maintaining local physics. She led me toward the main building, adding, though our instruments have detected increased activity in the past 3 weeks, coinciding with your condition changes. The implication was clear. My altered state was somehow resonating with the dimensional anomaly beneath the facility. Whether that was coincidence, causation, or something more deliberate remained to be seen. Inside, the public areas of the facility maintained the corporate retreat facade, tasteful furniture, abstract art, smiling staff who could easily pass for hospitality professionals rather than interdimensional defense specialists. Only when we descended in a restricted elevator, Grace's biometrics and security codes granting access to the sublevels, did the true nature of the operation become apparent. The elevator opened onto a vast operations center, a circular room filled with monitoring stations, holographic displays showing global anomaly tracking, and personnel moving with the focused intensity of those responsible for monitoring existential threats. At the center stood an illuminated global map dotted with colored indicators, red for active anomalies, yellow for potential developing sites, green for monitored but currently inactive locations. I noticed immediately that all 7 points of the former architect heptagram were yellow, upgraded from their previous green status. Something was happening at those sites, just as my father had warned. Dr. Victor Chun, the network's director of dimensional research, and Natalie's uncle, approached as we entered. In his mid-60s, Chun had the bearing of a distinguished academic, his silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses projecting scholarly authority. Only the faint scar running along his left jawline, a souvenir from an early encounter with a collector manifestation, hinted at his extensive field experience. "Sam," he greeted me, clasping my hand firmly. "Good to see you on your feet. Your recovery defies medical explanation." "It defies a lot of explanations," I replied. "Where's the cauterizer?" Chun raised an eyebrow at my directness, but didn't seem offended. "Secure storage, sublevel 5. Engineering team has been analyzing it since Michigan. The technology is remarkable, far beyond our current theoretical framework." "That's because it wasn't designed within our current framework," I said. "I need to see it, and I need access to the network's files on dimensional contamination survivors, specifically cases involving altered perception or enhanced capabilities following exposure events." Chin glanced at Grace, who gave a subtle nod. "Dr. Martinez forwarded her findings on your condition. Your cerebral restructuring is unique in our records. Are you experiencing further insights?" I hesitated, remembering Alex's warning about infiltration within the network. Chun had been with the organization since its early days, a pioneer in dimensional research and a friend of my father's. But could I be certain he wasn't compromised? That the Devourer hadn't somehow influenced him? "Let's discuss it in a more secure location," I suggested. "After I've examined the cauterizer." Chun led us to another elevator, this one requiring even more extensive security verification. Retinal scans, voice recognition, and quantum encryption keys that changed every 30 seconds. Sublevel 5 housed the network's most sensitive projects and dangerous artifacts, items too volatile or valuable to risk exposure. The cauterizer rested on a workbench in a specialized laboratory, surrounded by instruments I recognized and others that appeared to be custom-built for dimensional analysis. The device looked smaller than I remembered, its casing cracked in several places, the formerly gleaming metal now dull and discolored, battle scars from its deployment at Michigan. As I approached, the strange resonance in my mind intensified. Without thinking, I reached out and placed my hand on the cauterizer's surface. The contact sent a jolt through my system, not electrical, but something more fundamental, as if some part of my consciousness had briefly connected with the device's operational principles. Visions flashed through my mind, schematics, equations, modifications that would transform the cauterizer from a breach-sealing device to something more sophisticated. A diagnostic tool capable of identifying dimensional signatures across multiple frequency bands. A detection system that could pinpoint individuals whose consciousness had been altered by dimensional exposure. When the vision subsided, I found Chun and Grace watching me with concerned expressions. "Your eyes were changing color," Grace said quietly, "shifting through patterns of light." I blinked, my vision returning to normal. "I know how to modify it," I said, the knowledge crystal clear in my mind. "I can convert it into a detection system that will identify others like me, people whose consciousness has been altered by dimensional contact." "Others like you?" Chun questioned. "You believe there are more individuals with similar modifications?" 7 total, I confirmed, the number feeling significant beyond my understanding of why. Together, we can create a dimensional restoration network, not just sealing breaches, but actively repairing and strengthening the fabric of reality itself. I described what I'd learned in my dreams, about the Devourer, about the approaching threat, about the need to find the other dimensionally altered humans. As I spoke, I watched Chin carefully, looking for any reaction that might suggest he was compromised, but his expression showed only scientific curiosity and strategic concern, the appropriate responses of someone hearing about a new existential threat. "This is concerning," he said when I'd finished, "but not entirely unexpected. Our dimensional theorists have speculated about entities that might feed on dimensional collapse events. We've never encountered one directly, but the mathematics suggest such beings could exist." He moved to a computer terminal, entering a series of commands. A holographic display activated, showing a graph of dimensional stability measurements taken at the 7 former heptagram sites. We've been monitoring increasing instability at all 7 locations, he explained. Subtle changes in local dimensional integrity that our standard models can't account for. If what you're describing is accurate, these could be early signs of the Devourer's influence reaching our reality. How long before critical instability? Grace asked, her tactical mind immediately focusing on time frames. Chin shook his head. Impossible to say with current data. Weeks, months. The progression isn't linear. 3 months, I said with certainty. That's how long we have before the first major incursion attempt. I need to modify the cauterizer and locate the other 7 before then. I'll authorize full resources for both initiatives, Chin decided. But Sam, I need to understand more about these others you're seeking. How can we be certain they'll ally with us? If their consciousness has been altered by dimensional exposure, they might be unstable, dangerous, or already influenced by hostile entities. It was a valid concern. Dimensional contamination affected each person differently. Some emerged stronger, others broken, and some transformed into something no longer recognizably human in thought or motivation. That's why we need the modified cauterizer, I explained. It will allow us to distinguish between different types of dimensional alteration, to identify those who've been changed in ways compatible with our goals versus those who've been corrupted or damaged beyond reliability. Chin nodded slowly. Engineering team will provide whatever assistance you need, and I'll grant you access to our files on dimensional contamination survivors. He paused, his expression growing more serious. But Sam, there's something else you should know. Something we discovered while you were recovering. He led us to another section of the laboratory, where a sealed containment chamber housed what appeared to be a fragment of crystallized material, similar to the transformed matter we'd encountered in the Michigan anomaly zone, but more structured. Its geometric patterns suggesting deliberate design rather than random crystallization. This was recovered from your clothing after Michigan, Chin explained. It was embedded in your jacket, near your heart. Initially, we thought it was just debris from the transformation zone, but closer analysis revealed something disturbing. He activated a display showing microscopic views of the crystal fragment. At that scale, the geometric patterns resolved into something even more complex, structures that resembled circuitry, but with components that appeared to phase in and out of conventional reality. It's some kind of dimensional technology, Chin continued, more sophisticated than anything we've encountered before. And it's active, processing information, emitting signals on frequencies beyond our normal detection range. A cold sensation spread through my chest as I realized the implications. It's monitoring me, transmitting data about my condition, my location. That's our assessment, Chin confirmed. The question is to whom? The architects? This devourer entity you've described? Someone else entirely? I stared at the crystalline fragment, feeling a strange mixture of violation and fascination. Something had tagged me, was watching me through this technological parasite, and I hadn't even known it was there. We've kept it contained in a dimensional isolation field, Chin assured me. No signals in or out, but we wanted you to be aware of it. Can it be removed safely? Grace asked. Destroyed. Chin's expression was grim. We don't know how it's connected to Sam's altered condition. Tampering with it could potentially accelerate the neurological changes Dr. Martinez observed, or worse. Without understanding its purpose fully, removal could be more dangerous than leaving it contained. A monitoring device implanted near my heart without my knowledge. A tag that could be reporting my every move, my physiological state, perhaps even my thoughts to unknown entities beyond conventional reality. The invasion of privacy was profound, the security implications severe. Leave it contained for now, I had decided. Let me complete the cauterizer modifications first. Then maybe I can develop a way to analyze it more thoroughly, understand its purpose. Work on the cauterizer began immediately. Chin assigned his best engineers to assist me, though they quickly found themselves struggling to follow my instructions. The modifications I envisioned operated on principles beyond current human science, concepts that made perfect sense in my altered consciousness, but required extensive translation to implement in physical form. Days blurred together as I worked obsessively, sleeping only when absolute exhaustion demanded it. Each time I touched the cauterizer, more knowledge flowed into my mind, refinements to the design, improvements to the dimensional frequency detection systems, ways to increase sensitivity and accuracy. It was as if the device itself were communicating with me, or some part of my consciousness was retrieving technical specifications from beyond conventional reality. The engineers watched with a mixture of awe and unease as I intuitively solved problems that should have required months of theoretical work, fabricating components that shouldn't have been possible with existing technology. I wasn't just repairing the cauterizer. I was evolving it into something new, a dimensional resonance scanner that could detect and classify alterations in consciousness across multiple frequency bands. During one rare break, Grace brought me the files I'd requested, records of every known survivor of dimensional contamination events who had displayed unusual capabilities or altered perception afterward. The list was longer than I had expected, over 300 cases documented worldwide over the past 2 decades. Most have been monitored but not contacted, she explained as I began reviewing the files. Standard protocol for potentially unstable subjects. A few have been recruited into peripheral roles within the network, though none with full disclosure about the nature of our operations. I scanned through case files, looking for patterns, for the specific type of consciousness alteration I now recognized in myself. Most cases involved minor perceptual changes, synesthesia-like effects where subjects perceive dimensional anomalies as colors or sounds, brief precognitive episodes linked to dimensional thinning events, or enhanced pattern recognition related to interdimensional mathematics. But 7 cases stood out, individuals whose alterations went deeper, whose consciousness had been fundamentally reorganized rather than merely supplemented. As I reviewed their files, I felt a resonance, recognition that transcended the clinical descriptions and monitoring data. These were the ones my father had spoken of, potential members of the Dimensional Restoration Network. Ellie Kaufman, age 29, former particle physicist who had survived a catastrophic accident at a European accelerator facility involving what the network now recognized as a small-scale dimensional breach. After recovery, she demonstrated the ability to visualize quantum probability fields directly, perceiving potential futures as overlapping translucent images. Currently working as a financial consultant, using her abilities to predict market movements without understanding their true source. Michael Okonkwo, age 45, maritime engineer who had been the sole survivor when his research vessel sailed through what appeared to be a localized atmospheric phenomenon off the coast of Nigeria. In reality, the ship had briefly passed through a dimensional thin spot. After rescue, Michael developed the ability to instinctively navigate spaces that shouldn't connect, finding shortcuts through reality that defied conventional geometry. Currently working as a wilderness guide, known for bringing lost hikers home through seemingly impossible routes. Hiroko Tanaka, age 67, former Buddhist monk who had spent 40 days meditating in a cave system with documented dimensional anomalies, emerged with the ability to perceive and interact with what she described as pattern flows, currents of cause and effect across time and space. Currently operating a small consulting business in Kyoto, where clients seek her advice for life decisions without realizing she's literally seeing the branching paths of their possible futures. Alejandro Reyes, age 19, the youngest of the group, a street artist from Mexico City who had been caught in a dimensional fluctuation event disguised as a localized earthquake. Afterward, he began creating artwork that contained encoded interdimensional mathematics, complex formulae and models disguised as abstract designs. Currently creating murals across Central America, unknowingly leaving a trail of dimensional stabilization points through his art. Diana Cross, age 52, former military intelligence officer who had encountered a collector manifestation during an operation in Eastern Europe. After exposure, developed what the network classified as consciousness splitting, the ability to maintain multiple simultaneous awareness states, effectively multithreading her consciousness across different perceptual frameworks. Currently working as a private security consultant, her unusual abilities mistaken for exceptional multitasking skills. Wei Zhang, age 38, quantum computing researcher who had accidentally created a micro-breach while experimenting with novel quantum entanglement processes. After recovery from apparent seizures during the event, demonstrated the ability to process and manipulate information at superhuman speeds, his consciousness partially operating on quantum principles rather than classical neurological ones. Currently employed by a major tech company, his abilities disguised as savant-like program, ing skills, and the seventh file, the one that sent a chill through me when I saw the name, Eliza Chun, age 42, former research director at Quantum Wave, presumed dead after the Seattle incident, the same incident where Alex had sacrificed himself to close a major dimensional breach. The file indicated she had been found 6 months later in a homeless shelter, physically intact but with severe memory loss and altered brain function. Most disturbing were the dimensional scans included in her file, energy patterns surrounding her consciousness that looked disturbingly similar to the architect's signatures, but with subtle differences that suggested independent evolution rather than direct influence. Currently living under network supervision in a controlled environment facility, classified as stable but potentially compromised. Dr. Eliza Chun, the woman whose research had nearly allowed the collector to establish a permanent foothold in our reality. The scientist whose brother, Marcus, had continued similar work through Meridian Technologies, creating the Michigan Breach site, and now potentially one of the 7 individuals whose altered consciousness was key to stopping the Devourer. The cosmic irony was almost too perfect. I brought the files to Grace, pointing out the 7 candidates. These are the ones we need. The ones whose dimensional frequency signatures will align with the restoration network. She examined the files, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she reached Eliza Chen's. Sam, you can't be serious about her, after everything she's responsible for. I'm not making these selections based on moral considerations, I interrupted. Their altered consciousness signatures are what matter. The dimensional mathematics require these specific frequency patterns to create a stable heptagram. Eliza Chun is dangerous, Grace insisted. Her work opened the door for the collector. Her brother created the Michigan Breach. The Chun family has consistently been on the wrong side of this conflict. And yet, Victor Chun has been a cornerstone of the Witness Network for decades, I pointed out. Same family, different choices. Grace had no immediate response to that. The Chun family's complicated legacy in dimensional research was well documented. Pioneers in the field who had diverged dramatically in how they applied their knowledge. Victor toward protection and containment, Eliza and Marcus toward exploration and exploitation. Even if you're right about these 7, Grace said finally, extracting them from their current lives won't be simple. They're scattered across the globe, most under regular network monitoring, but not direct contact. And Eliza is under level 4 containment protocols. Accessing her would require director-level authorization. Then get it, I said simply. We're facing an interdimensional entity that consumes entire realities. Protocol concern seems somewhat secondary. Grace sighed, rubbing her temples. I'll speak with Chun about Eliza and coordinate extraction teams for the others. But Sam, she hesitated. How certain are you about all this? About these specific people? About the Devourer itself? It was a fair question. Everything I'd been acting on had come through dreams and intuition, through knowledge that had appeared in my mind without clear source or verification. I couldn't blame Grace for harboring doubts. I'm certain, I said after a moment, but I understand your skepticism. That's why I'm rushing to complete the scanner. Once operational, it will provide objective verification, hard data to support what I've been seeing subjectively. She nodded, apparently satisfied with this compromise between immediate action and scientific verification. I'll begin preparations for contacting the first 6. Eliza will address that challenge separately. As Grace left to make arrangements, I returned to the modified cauterizer, now taking shape as something far more sophisticated than its original design. The engineers had begun calling it the Dimensional Resonance Scanner, or DRS, a name that felt appropriate for its expanded capabilities. Another day of intense work brought the device to operational readiness, now smaller, more refined, with a specialized interface designed to connect directly with my altered neurological patterns. The DRS hummed with potential as I activated it for the first time. The laboratory lighting dimmed automatically as the device powered up, drawing significant energy for its initial calibration phase. Holographic displays sprang to life around it, showing multidimensional models that the engineers present couldn't fully interpret, but that made perfect sense to my altered perception. Beginning initial scan, I announced, placing my hands on the interface panels that would allow my consciousness to directly guide the device's functions. The connection was immediate and profound, like plugging my mind into a vastly expanded sensory system. Through the DRS, I could perceive dimensional frequencies across a spectrum far broader than my natural abilities allowed. The laboratory, people in it, the mountain facility around us, all became transparent overlays showing not just their physical properties, but their dimensional signatures, their connections to the broader multiverse. Most ordinary objects and people appeared as expected, firmly anchored in our dimensional plane, with only the normal quantum fluctuations that characterize all matter. But as I expanded the scan's range, I began detecting anomalies. First, the natural dimensional thin spot beneath the facility, a beautiful, complex pattern of interweaving realities, like a reef where multiple ecosystems meet and mingle. Then, more concerning, 7 distinct disruption patterns centered on the former heptagram sites: Michigan, Oregon, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, New York, and Ontario. The dimensional fabric at these locations showed signs of stress, microscopic fractures forming and sealing in rhythmic patterns that suggested deliberate testing of structural integrity. Probing fingers from beyond, methodically searching for weaknesses, I adjusted the DRS parameters, focusing on conscious entities rather than locations. Immediately, my own unique signature appeared. Complex, evolving patterns showing strong connections to multiple dimensional planes. Beside it, comparative models of normal human consciousness, singularly anchored, dimensionally stable, limited to conventional perceptual frameworks. Then, scattered across the global map, 7 distinct signatures that resonated with my own, the individuals I'd identified from the files, each pattern unique but harmonically related, together forming a potential structure that could, if properly aligned and activated, create a dimensional counterforce against the approaching threat. Most significantly, the DRS confirmed what I'd suspected about Eliza Chun. Her consciousness signature showed clear evidence of architect influence, but not control or corruption. Rather, her exposure had restructured her awareness along lines sympathetic to architect dimensional mathematics while remaining fundamentally human in nature and autonomy. She wasn't compromised. She was transformed. Just as I had been, just as all 7 candidates had been, each in their unique way. But the DRS revealed something else, something I hadn't anticipated. A shadow pattern underlying the global dimensional landscape, subtle but pervasive, not concentrated at the heptagram sites, but distributed throughout our reality's fabric, like an infection spreading through microscopic channels. The Devourer's influence was already here, already working within our dimensional framework, not yet manifested in full force, but present as potential, as possibility, as quantum-level manipulation gradually shifting probabilities toward outcomes that favored its eventual manifestation. More alarmingly, the DRS detected human consciousness signatures that showed subtle contamination, individuals whose awareness had been partially compromised, not through direct possession but through gradual exposure to the Devourer's dimensional frequencies. Most showed only minor effects, perhaps experiencing occasional intrusive thoughts or subtle behavioral changes they themselves wouldn't notice. But a smaller number, approximately 50 individuals globally, showed more significant alteration. People whose decision-making, perception, and behavior were being substantially influenced without their knowledge. And these individuals weren't randomly distributed. They occupied positions of influence across governmental, scientific, and security organizations, including 3 within the Witness network itself. I kept this discovery carefully shielded as I disengaged from the DRS, not revealing through expression or comment what I'd found. The laboratory engineers and scientists gathered around, eager to hear my assessment of the device's functionality. Initial calibration successful. I reported neutrally. The scanner is operating within expected parameters. I'll need to review the data thoroughly before drawing conclusions. Dr. Victor Chun, who had arrived during the testing process, nodded with satisfaction. Remarkable work, especially given the time frame. The engineering team reports that many of the principles you've implemented are beyond their current understanding. I'm still working to translate the underlying mathematics into conventional frameworks, I said, a diplomatic way of acknowledging that much of what I'd built operated on principles I understood intuitively, but couldn't fully explain using existing scientific language. Take whatever time you need for analysis, Chun replied. In the meantime, Grace has briefed me on your candidate selections. Extraction teams are being assembled for the first 6 subjects. As for Eliza, he hesitated. That situation is more complex. Her containment protocols were implemented for good reason. I understand the concerns, I said carefully, watching his dimensional signature for any fluctuations that might betray devourer influence. Nothing obvious appeared, but the subtle shadow I detected throughout the facility made absolute certainty impossible. But the DRS confirms her consciousness signature is critical to the restoration network's functionality. Chin studied me thoughtfully. You seem very certain about this approach, Sam. More certain than the available evidence would typically warrant. I'm not questioning your insights, merely trying to understand their source. A reasonable request, but a dangerous one to answer fully given what I now suspected about infiltration within the network. I opted for a partial truth. My neural restructuring has created what amounts to an intuitive understanding of interdimensional mathematics, I explained. I perceive solutions and connections that I can't always articulate through conventional reasoning. The DRS was built to provide objective verification of these intuitions, to translate subjective insights into measurable data. And it confirms your theory about these 7 individuals. Chun pressed. It confirms their consciousness signatures contain the necessary harmonic relationships to form a dimensionally resonant network, I replied. Whether that network will function as theorized remains to be tested. Chun nodded slowly. I'll authorize preliminary contact with the first 6 candidates. Eliza's situation will require additional review. Her current psychological stability is questionable at best. As the meeting concluded and personnel dispersed to their various assignments, I remained with the DRS, ostensibly reviewing data but actually contemplating my next moves with extreme care. 3 compromised individuals within the network, unknowing agents of the devourer, their decisions subtly guided to facilitate its eventual manifestation. I couldn't be certain of their identities without more focused scanning, but the statistical likelihood of senior personnel being targeted was high. The devourer or its influence would logically seek to compromise those with greatest access and authority, which meant I couldn't fully trust anyone, not Chun, not the security teams being assembled, not even Grace herself. The paranoia this realization induced was almost paralyzing. How could I proceed with assembling the restoration network when the very organization supporting me might be unconsciously working against its success? The crystalline fragment recovered from my clothing took on new significance in light of this discovery. Was it truly monitoring me for some hostile entity? Or could it be a protective measure implemented by my father and Alex? A tool to shield me from the subtle influence affecting others? I needed more information, more verification before making accusations that could fracture the network when unity was most crucial. I needed private access to the DRS without monitoring or oversight, to conduct targeted scans of key personnel. And I needed to reach Eliza Chun before anyone else did. If her consciousness signature was as critical as I believed, she represented both our greatest vulnerability and our greatest asset. Whatever her past actions, whatever responsibility she bore for previous dimensional incursions, her altered consciousness now made her essential to preventing the devourer's manifestation. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me, that those who had opened the doors between dimensions, who had enabled threats like the Collector to enter our reality, might now be instrumental in saving it from an even greater danger. The universe, it seemed, had a peculiar sense of cosmic balance. As I contemplated these challenges, I became aware of a subtle change in my perception, a thinning of the veil between consciousness states, a familiar sensation that preceded communication from beyond conventional reality. My father and Alex were trying to reach me again. I needed solitude, a space where I could safely enter the receptive state necessary for such communication without observation. The monitoring equipment in my assigned quarters made that impossible. The dimensional thin spot beneath the facility might provide natural camouflage for the energy fluctuations such contact would generate, but accessing the deepest sublevels would require explanations I wasn't prepared to give. Then I remembered something from the facility schematics I'd reviewed. An abandoned research laboratory on sublevel 3, decommissioned after an experiment gone wrong, had created lingering dimensional instabilities too minor to warrant complete containment, but significant enough to render the space unsuitable for sensitive work. Perfect for my purposes. I made my way there under the pretense of needing to calibrate a portable version of the DRS against known dimensional anomalies. The laboratory showed signs of hasty abandonment, equipment pushed against walls, workstations partially disassembled, containment fields still active around one corner, where the residual dimensional instability was strongest. After ensuring I was alone, I activated a small dimensional anchor I'd modified to create not stability but privacy, a bubble of altered space-time that would mask energy fluctuations from the facility's monitoring systems. Then I sat on the floor, closed my eyes, and opened my consciousness to the signal trying to reach me from beyond conventional existence. The transition was smoother this time, my altered neurological structure more readily accepting the expanded state necessary for cross-dimensional communication. The laboratory dissolved around me, replaced by the now familiar representational space, a simplified interface where my father and Alex could interact with my consciousness without overwhelming it completely. They appeared as they had before, forms composed of light and information rather than matter, recognizable more through essence than specific physical features. But this time they weren't alone. A third figure stood with them, feminine in energy signature if not in conventional appearance, familiar in a way I couldn't immediately place. The situation has accelerated, my father said without preamble. The Devourer has sensed your activities, recognized the potential threat of the Restoration Network. It's moving more aggressively now, strengthening its influence over compromised individuals within your reality. I detected 3 within the network itself, I confirmed. How many more are there? More than we initially estimated, Alex replied grimly. The process is subtle, difficult to detect until well advanced. It begins with dreams, with subconscious suggestions that align decision-making toward favorable outcomes for manifestation. Who can I trust? I asked, the question that had been haunting me since the DRS scan. Grace remains uncompromised, my father assured me. Her mental discipline and awareness of interdimensional influence techniques provide natural resistance. Dr. Martinez as well. Victor Chun, he hesitated, shows early signs of influence, but has not yet been significantly compromised. His decisions remain primarily his own, and the security teams being assembled to contact the candidates? Variable levels of compromise, Alex admitted. You cannot rely on them to act in the network's best interests, even if they believe they are doing so. The Devourer operates through subtle probability manipulation, nudging events toward favorable outcomes rather than direct control. Then I need to reach the candidates myself, starting with Eliza Chun, I concluded. The DRS confirmed her consciousness signature is essential to the Restoration Network. Yes, the third figure spoke for the first time, her voice triggering immediate recognition despite its altered quality. My sister's mind was rewritten by direct contact with architect consciousness during the Seattle incident. She perceives dimensional mathematics as intuitive reality rather an abstract concept, critical for the network's stability. Natalie Chun, but not as I knew her from my living interactions. This was her consciousness liberated from physical constraints, existing in the same state as my father and Alex, which meant you died. I realized aloud. When? 2 days ago, she replied matter-of-factly. Cerebral hemorrhage caused by progressive dimensional contamination from my work analyzing Michigan samples. My physical death hasn't been reported to the network yet. They believe I'm in intensive care following a collapse during laboratory work. The casual way she related her own death was disconcerting, but consistent with the perspective shift I'd glimpsed during my own brief journey beyond conventional existence. Physical death apparently seemed less significant when consciousness continued in altered form. Natalie has joined our efforts on this side, my father explained. Her expertise in dimensional contamination analysis has already proven valuable, and her connection to Eliza may help us reach her more effectively, Alex added. The bond between siblings creates resonance patterns that transcend conventional dimensional boundaries. I processed this new development, trying to overcome my shock at Natalie's death and focus on the strategic implications. Can you help me reach all 7 candidates before the network's compromised elements interfere? Direct intervention in physical events has limitations, my father cautioned. We can influence probability to a degree, create opportunities, but not guarantee outcomes. The Devourer operates under similar constraints currently, but its influence grows as the dimensional barriers weaken. Your best approach is Eliza first, Natalie advised. Once you've secured her cooperation, her dimensional perception capabilities will help identify and counter Devourer influence within the network. Together, you'll have greater chance of reaching the others safely. How do I get to her? She's under level 4 containment, and after what the DRS revealed, I can't trust the official channels to grant access. Alex's form shifted slightly, information patterns rearranging to communicate a new concept. The containment facility has its own dimensional thin spot, a minor anomaly that predates the building itself. With the portable DRS modified for amplification rather than detection, you could create a temporary passage directly into her quarters. Essentially a controlled dimensional breach, my father clarified. Extremely dangerous under normal circumstances, but your altered consciousness should allow you to maintain stability during the transition. Should? I questioned, noting the uncertainty. There are no guarantees when manipulating dimensional boundaries, Natalie said bluntly, but the alternative is allowing Eliza to remain isolated while Devourer influence within the network grows. Time is against us, Sam. She was right, of course. Every day, every hour potentially strengthened the Devourer's position while weakening ours. The restoration network needed to be assembled and activated before the first major incursion attempt, now less than 3 months away, according to my father's earlier estimate. I'll need schematics for the containment facility, details of the security systems, and precise coordinates for this dimensional thin spot. I said, decision made. Already being transferred, my father replied, and I felt new information flowing into my consciousness. Technical specifications, security protocols, geographical coordinates, all somehow downloaded directly into my memory as if I'd studied them for weeks. One more thing, Alex added, his tone growing more urgent. The crystalline fragment they found on you, it's not what they think. Not a monitoring device placed by hostile entities. Then what is it? I asked, remembering the strange technology currently contained in the network's laboratory. A dimensional anchor point, he explained, designed specifically for your altered consciousness pattern. We created it, embedded it during your clinical death episode as a safeguard against certain possibilities. What possibilities? I pressed, sensing there was more they weren't telling me. The 3 exchanged what might have been glances and entities composed of light and information. Sam, my father finally said, his tone gentle but serious, your neurological restructuring is continuing, accelerating beyond our initial projections. The changes to your consciousness are more profound than you've yet realized. Dr. Martinez mentioned personality dissociation risks. I acknowledged. Loss of human emotional responses, potential identity fragmentation. That's part of it, Natalie confirmed. But there's another risk, one specific to consciousness patterns that evolve toward multidimensional perception. Transcendence threshold, Alex applied. a point at which human consciousness can no longer be sustained within conventional physical constraints. Essentially, involuntary dimensional shifting, your consciousness separating from your physical form, drawn toward higher dimensional planes. The implication was clear and terrifying. I was evolving toward a state like theirs, toward existence beyond conventional physicality, not through death as they had experienced, but through consciousness evolution that might render physical existence impossible to maintain. How long? I asked, the same question I'd posed to Dr. Martinez, but now with deeper significance. Without intervention, between 2 and 3 months, my father answered, coinciding with the Devourer's projected first major incursion attempt. The cosmic timing felt deliberate, a convergence too precise to be coincidence. The fragment is preventing this transcendence. Slowing it, Natalie clarified, providing an anchor point that helps maintain your consciousness's connection to physical reality. Without it, the process would accelerate unpredictably. So I'm racing 3 clocks simultaneously, I summarized grimly. The Devourer's approach, my own diminishing humanity, and now this transcendence threshold, while trying to assemble 7-dimensionally altered humans into a functional restoration network with unknown opposition from within our own organization. The stakes have always been high, my father acknowledged. But yes, the convergence of factors makes your position uniquely challenging. And critical, Alex added. Your specific consciousness pattern, hovering at the edge of transcendence, creates capabilities no other human currently possesses. You're a bridge between dimensional states, able to access higher dimensional insights while still operating within conventional physical reality. For now, I amended darkly. For long enough, Natalie insisted. If you act quickly, decisively, starting with my sister. The communication was beginning to destabilize, the representational space flickering as maintaining the connection became increasingly difficult. My father's form approached, reaching out in a gesture that translated as comforting despite its non-physical nature. We'll continue guiding you as we can, he said, his presence already fading. Trust grace. Trust the altered 7. Trust yourself, even as you change. And Sam, Alex added as the space collapsed around us, remember that humanity isn't defined by neurological structure. It's defined by choice, by compassion, by the decision to protect rather than exploit. However you change, hold on to that. The laboratory reformed around me as I returned to conventional consciousness, gasping as if I'd been underwater. The transition was becoming more jarring each time, the contrast between expanded awareness and physical limitation increasingly uncomfortable. I checked my watch. Nearly 3 hours had passed, though the communication had seemed to last only minutes. Time dilation effects were worsening, another sign of my progressing condition. I needed to move quickly, before my absence triggered concern or suspicion. The portable DRS I brought to the laboratory would need significant modification to create the dimensional passage Alex had described. I had the knowledge now, downloaded directly into my consciousness during the communication, but implementing it would require components not readily available in this abandoned lab. I'd need to acquire materials, modify the device, and create a cover story for my absence during the operation, all without alerting potentially compromised network personnel to my intentions. A formidable challenge under normal circumstances, nearly impossible given the facility's security protocols and monitoring systems. But I was no longer operating under normal human constraints. My altered consciousness perceived possibilities, connections, and vulnerabilities that others would miss. The very changes that threatened my humanity also provided tools to accomplish what needed to be done. As I gathered my equipment and prepared to leave the laboratory, I felt a curious sensation, a momentary splitting of perception, as if I were briefly observing myself from outside my own body. The experience lasted only seconds, but left me deeply unsettled. The transcendence threshold was approaching faster than predicted. My time as a physical entity was growing shorter by the day. All the more reason to act quickly, to reach Eliza Chun, to begin assembling the restoration network, to create a defense against the devourer before my consciousness evolved beyond the ability to directly affect physical reality. The irony was painful, that just as I gained the knowledge and capabilities needed to protect our dimension, I was losing the physical existence necessary to implement that protection. A cosmic joke at humanity's expense, perhaps, or a test of whether I could accomplish what was needed before my transformation progressed beyond the point of no return. Either way, the clock was ticking. For me, for humanity, for reality itself. No pressure, right?